Picture this, a dark, misty morning on the North Sea, where the water seems to merge with the sky in an endless grey expanse. Suddenly, a shape emerges from the fog, a Viking longship, its dragon-headed prow cutting through the waves like a blade. For a moment, you can almost hear the creak of the oars, feel the chill of the spray, and sense the determination of the crew as they venture into the unknown. This is the image burned into our collective minds, but what if I told you that this powerful scene is just the beginning of a story far more complex, far more surprising than anything we've been taught? We all think we know the Vikings' fierce warriors with horned helmets, raiders who appeared out of nowhere to plunder and vanish. But what if everything you've been told is wrong? What if the Vikings were not just destroyers but builders, not just raiders but explorers, traders, and innovators whose influence stretched across continents and whose secrets have been hidden for centuries? Today, we're setting sail on a journey to uncover 30 astonishing secrets of the Viking Age that will completely rewrite your understanding of this fascinating era. From their mysterious navigation techniques that allowed them to cross treacherous oceans without modern tools, to their vast trade networks that connected the markets of Baghdad with the shores of North America, the Vikings were far more than the one-dimensional characters we often picture. They were pioneers of globalization, masters of craft and culture, and keepers of knowledge that still intrigues us today. So settle in, because by the end of this video, you won't just see the Vikings differently, you'll see the world differently. This is a story of human ambition, curiosity, and resilience, and it's one you won't want to miss. Let's start by shattering the single biggest piece of Viking imagery we all have in our heads. We see them in movies, in cartoons, on beer bottles, the Viking warrior screaming into battle, wearing a helmet with huge, intimidating horns. It's an iconic picture, but it's completely, utterly false. The truth is, there is zero archaeological evidence that Vikings ever wore horned helmets into battle. Not a single one has ever been found from the Viking Age. So where did this idea come from? The answer takes us not to a dusty archaeological dig, but to a theater stage in the 1870s. The man responsible for this colossal mix-up was a German costume designer named Karl Emil Doppler. He was hired to create the outfits for a massive, groundbreaking opera by composer Richard Wagner called Der Ring des Nibelungen, or the Ring Cycle. This opera was based on Norse mythology, and Doppler wanted the characters to look dramatic, mythical, and imposing for the audience. So he designed helmets with horns and wings, drawing inspiration from descriptions of ancient Germanic priests and gods from centuries before the Vikings. It was a fantastic piece of theater costume design, but it was pure fiction. The opera was a massive hit, and its imagery spread like wildfire, becoming forever tangled with the real history of the Vikings. Now, let's look at what real Viking warriors actually wore on their heads. The archaeological record is sparse. Helmets were valuable, often passed down or recycled, so very few have survived. The most spectacular example we have is the German Boo helmet, discovered in a burial mound in Norway. It's a simple, functional iron helmet, often called a spectacle helmet because of the eye guard that forms a sort of mask around the eyes and nose. It was designed for one thing only: protection. It's a piece of military equipment, not a ceremonial headdress. Think about it practically for a moment. In the close quarters chaos of a shield wall, a helmet with large horns would be a massive liability. It would be incredibly top-heavy, easily grabbed by an opponent to yank your head down, and could deflect a sword blow directly into your own neck. A real Viking warrior would have seen a horned helmet as a death sentence. Their head protection was far more likely to be a simple, conical cap made of hardened leather or iron, sometimes with a nose guard designed to deflect blows rather than catch them. So the next time you picture a Viking, replace that horned helmet with the image of the German. helmet a pragmatic, fierce, and brutally effective piece of armor for one of history's most formidable fighters. This myth is a perfect example of how pop culture can rewrite history, and it's our first secret because it forces us to question everything we think we know. But if the horned helmet myth shows us how Viking warriors have been misunderstood, the role of women in their society reveals a truth that is even more startling. We often imagine Viking women waiting at home, tending the hearth while the men went off to raid and explore. The reality, however, was that many Viking women were power brokers in their own right, wielding a level of independence that was almost unheard of in much of medieval Europe. Norse society was built on a legal framework that granted women specific and significant rights. A free woman, known as a kona, could personally own land and property. This wasn't just a trivial right, it meant she could inherit wealth from her father if there were no sons, and she retained control over her own possessions and the dowry she brought into a marriage. This economic independence was the foundation of her power. This legal standing extended into her marital life as well. A Viking woman had the right to initiate a divorce. The process was straightforward by the standards of the day. She would simply call witnesses to her home and declare herself divorced from her husband in front of them. The reasons could range from his poverty to his violence, or even something as simple as him wearing clothes that were too feminine, a sign he might not be a strong provider. Once divorced, she would reclaim her dowry and any other property she owned, allowing her to walk away and start again with her wealth and social standing intact. This was a profound level of personal agency for the time. Beyond the home and the law, women also took on vital public roles. They were the keepers of religion, serving as priestesses known as jidjar, who presided over important ceremonies and sacrifices to the gods. They were also astute businesswomen, managing complex trade operations at home while their husbands were away, or even traveling themselves as merchants. Archaeological finds of scales and weights in female graves testify to their involvement in commerce, weighing silver and goods with precision. But the most dramatic evidence shattering the old image of Viking women comes from a grave in Birka, Sweden, a major trading center. For over a century after its discovery in the 1870s, archaeologists were certain the opulent grave, filled with weapons, armor, 2 horses, and a full set of game pieces for military strategy, belonged to a high-ranking male warrior. It was considered a textbook example of a Viking warlord's burial. That all changed in 2017 when a team of researchers decided to analyze the skeleton's DNA. The results were stunning. The warrior was biologically female. This wasn't just a woman who was buried with a few sentimental items. This was a high-ranking military leader laid to rest with the full honors of a professional tactician. The game pieces suggest she was a master of strategy, someone who commanded troops and planned battles. This discovery forces a complete re-evaluation of the Viking sagas, which occasionally spoke of shield maidens, female warriors who fought alongside men. Historians had often dismissed these accounts as mere myths or legends, but the Birka warrior grave provides powerful physical evidence that they were real. It suggests that while not all women were warriors, the path to becoming one was at least a possibility in Viking society, a notion that challenges our deepest assumptions about gender roles in the ancient world. These women were not just background characters, they were landowners, entrepreneurs, religious leaders, and in at least one confirmed case, a formidable military commander. And speaking of journeys that shatter expectations, let's set our course west, far beyond the fjords of Scandinavia, and even beyond the Viking settlements of Iceland and Greenland. We're heading to a continent that, according to the history books, was completely unknown to Europe until 1492. But the history books are wrong on that count too. The truth is, Viking feet walked the shores of North America a full 500 years before Christopher Columbus was even born. This isn't a theory or a myth, it's a fact proven by hard archaeological evidence. The story begins with a young man named Leif Erikson, son of the infamous Eric the Red, who founded the first Norse settlements in Greenland. Around the year 1000 AD, a merchant named Bjarni Herjolfsson told a fascinating story at Eric's court. He claimed that while sailing from Iceland to Greenland, his ship had been blown wildly off course by a storm. For days, they were lost in a thick fog, and when it finally cleared, they saw a land to the west that was flat and covered with forests, a description that didn't match Greenland's icy mountains at all. Intrigued, Leif Erikson bought Bjarni's ship, gathered a crew of 35 men, and retraced the merchant's accidental route, intent on exploring this mysterious new land. Their voyage was a masterclass in Norse navigation. Sailing into the unknown, they first reached a barren, rocky shore they called Helluland, which we now know as Baffin Island. Sailing further south, they found a wooded coast with white sandy beaches, which they named Markland, believed to be modern-day Labrador, but the real prize was still to come. Continuing south, they eventually found a place so idyllic, so rich with resources, that Leif named it Vinland. The name likely comes from the wild grapes or berries they found growing there, a sign of a milder climate, and the area was teeming with salmon in the rivers and towering trees perfect for building ships and houses, a priceless commodity in nearly treeless Greenland. For a while, the Norse established a small settlement there, a base for exploring, trading, and harvesting valuable timber to send back to Greenland. The sagas tell of both peaceful encounters and violent clashes with the local indigenous people, whom they called Skraelings. But the Norse presence in Vinland was short-lived, lasting perhaps only a decade or two. The distance from Greenland was vast, the local population was formidable, and maintaining a viable colony proved too difficult. The stories of Vinland eventually faded into legend, dismissed by historians for centuries as just that, legendary tales with no basis in fact. That all changed in the 1960s. A Norwegian husband and wife team of explorers, Helge and Anne Stein Ingstad, refused to dismiss the sagas as mere fiction. They meticulously studied the descriptions of the coastline and, convinced that Vinland was in Newfoundland, Canada, began an extensive search. Their investigation led them to a small, remote fishing village at the northernmost tip of the island called Elance Ox Meadows. There, they met a local fisherman who showed them some overgrown, strange-looking mounds on his property that he always thought were just old Indian burial sites. The Ingstads immediately began to excavate, and what they uncovered sent shockwaves through the archaeological world. They found the unmistakable remains of 8 Norse buildings, including 3 large multi-room longhouses, a forge for smithing iron, a carpentry workshop, and even a simple bathhouse. This wasn't a temporary camp, it was a small but permanent base of operations, a Stromfjordur or Bay of Currents as described in the sagas, perfectly positioned for exploring the Gulf of St. Lawrence. The evidence they unearthed was irrefutable. They found a bronze cloak pin, unmistakably Norse in design. They found a stone lamp identical to those used in Iceland. Most tellingly, in the forge they found slag, the waste product from smelting iron, proving the Vikings were processing local bog iron to make nails and tools for repairing their ships. Radiocarbon dating of charcoal from the fireplaces placed the settlement right around the year 1000 AD, perfectly aligning with the saga accounts of Leif Erikson's voyage. Elance Ox Meadows is a UNESCO World Heritage Site, and it stands as the first and only confirmed Norse site in North America. It proves beyond any doubt that the Vikings were the first Europeans to cross the Atlantic and set foot on the continent. They didn't just accidentally stumble upon it, they established a foothold, explored the region, and began to exploit its resources. This single archaeological site transforms the Viking Age from a European story into a global one, rewriting the narrative of world exploration and forever cementing the Norse as the most intrepid explorers of their era. Crossing the stormy, unpredictable North Atlantic in an open longship is a feat that seems almost superhuman today. With no GPS, no satellites, and often no visible landmarks for weeks, how did the Vikings not just get hopelessly lost at sea? The answer lies in a combination of sophisticated technology, deep environmental knowledge, and a possible tool that sounds like it's straight out of a fantasy novel. Forget the simple idea of them just following the coast. These were master navigators of the open ocean. Their most important tool was likely the sun compass. This wasn't a magnetic compass, which they might have encountered through trade but didn't reliably use. A Viking sun compass was a wooden disc with a central gnomon, a small pin that would cast a shadow. Around the edge of the disc were a series of notches marking the hours of the day. By keeping the shadow of the gnomon falling within the correct notch for that time of day, a navigator could maintain a consistent east-west course. This was crucial for latitude sailing. The practice of finding a specific latitude, the line of a particular star or the sun's height at noon, and then turning east or west to follow that line until they hit their destination. It was a brilliantly simple yet incredibly effective system for staying on course under a clear sky. But the North Atlantic is rarely clear. It's a place of howling winds, dense fogs, and endless cloud cover that could blot out the sun for days. This is where the legend of the Solarstein or Sunstone comes into play. Medieval texts like the saga of King Olaf mention this mysterious crystal being used to locate the sun on overcast days. For centuries, historians dismissed this as a mere myth, a poetic metaphor. But modern science has revealed that it was not only possible but highly probable. The leading candidate for the sunstone is a crystal known as Iceland spar, a transparent form of calcite that is common in Scandinavia. This crystal has a unique property called birefringence. When light passes through it, it splits into two beams. By rotating the crystal and looking through it toward the sky, even through thick cloud cover, a skilled user could find the point where the two beams of light are of equal intensity. This alignment would directly point to the hidden sun's position, giving the navigator a precise celestial fix. Laboratory experiments and real-world tests aboard a French research vessel have proven that Iceland spar is remarkably accurate, capable of pinpointing the sun's location within a few degrees, even after it has set below the horizon. This wasn't magic, it was an ingenious application of optical physics, a secret weapon that gave Viking navigators a critical edge over the elements. Their toolkit didn't end with technology. They were profoundly intimate readers of the natural world. They constantly observed wave patterns, understanding how the swell changed as they neared land. They noted the behavior of birds. A lone bird flying a steady course in the evening was likely heading toward land, while the sight of certain species told them how far they were from shore. They watched for cloud formations, which often gather over land masses or ice fields, and they were experts in reading the color of the sea and the smell of the wind, which could carry the scent of pine forests or tundra from dozens of miles away. This combination of cutting-edge technology for its time and profound natural wisdom allowed them to achieve the impossible, transforming the terrifying expanse of the ocean into a highway for exploration, trade, and conquest. While their reputation as fierce explorers and warriors preceded them, the Vikings carried another, far more pleasant surprise for the people they encountered. An almost obsessive commitment to cleanliness that made them stand out starkly in the often filthy medieval world. If you were to time travel back to a Viking-age trading town and then to a major European city like London or Paris around the same time, the difference would be immediately apparent, and not in the way you might expect. To their contemporaries, particularly the fastidious Arab travelers who documented their ways, the Vikings were known as the cleanest people in Europe, a title they earned through daily habits that would be considered modern even centuries later. The most telling evidence comes not from ancient texts but from the graves themselves. Archaeologists routinely find elaborate personal grooming kits buried alongside warriors and traders. These weren't just simple tools, they were comprehensive sets designed for meticulous upkeep. A typical kit might include finely crafted bone combs, often housed in their own decorative cases to keep the teeth from breaking. They used straight razors with sharp iron blades for shaving and trimming beards, and small, precision tweezers made from bronze or iron for plucking eyebrows and managing facial hair. Perhaps most surprisingly, they utilized ear cleaners, delicate little spoons designed for the fastidious removal of wax. These items were so valued that they were personal possessions men took to their graves, signaling that grooming was a fundamental part of a Viking's identity, as important as his weapons or his jewelry. This dedication extended to their weekly routine with a practice that horrified some Christian observers: regular bathing. The Old Norse word for Saturday, logadaga, doesn't refer to a god or a celestial body. It literally translates to pool washing day, indicating a dedicated weekly bath. In an era when many in Europe believed that water could carry disease into the body through the pores and that filth was a sign of piety, the Vikings were actively seeking it out. They built saunas using heated stones to create steam, and would beat themselves with bunches of twigs to stimulate circulation before plunging into a cool stream or pool. This practice was about more than just cleanliness. It was a social and ritualistic event, a way to relax, converse, and prepare for the week ahead. The contrast with much of medieval Christendom could not have been more extreme. While the Vikings were steaming and washing, many European monks and nobles were pursuing holiness through abstention from bathing. It was commonly believed that a layer of dirt protected one from illness, and that immersing the whole body in water was a dangerous, even sinful act of indulgence. Accounts from the time describe the grime on unwashed bodies and the overwhelming stench of crowded cities. To these cultures, the Vikings' habit of bathing once a week, combing their hair daily, and changing their clothes regularly seemed bizarre and excessive. An English chronicler from the Anglo-Saxon period even expressed disgust at the Danish Vikings' custom of bathing every Saturday, combing their hair, and changing their woolen undershirts, viewing it as a strange form of vanity designed to seduce English women. This commitment to hygiene had a very practical side beyond social appeal. A clean Viking was a healthy Viking, especially on long sea voyages. Keeping wounds clean, preventing lice infestations, and maintaining general health were critical to the success of a raiding party or a merchant crew crammed into a longship for weeks on end. Their grooming kits were as essential to their survival as their swords and shields. This revelation completely upends the stereotypical image of the grimy, unkempt barbarian. The reality was a culture that took pride in its appearance, valued personal upkeep, and possessed a sophisticated understanding of hygiene that would not become common in the rest of Europe for hundreds of years. Their cleanliness wasn't just a habit, it was a mark of civilization. Yet for all their skill in navigating the open ocean, their true impact on the medieval world wasn't just about the lands they discovered. It was about the astonishing web of commerce they spun, connecting distant cultures that had no idea the other even existed. If you imagine the Viking world as just Scandinavia and the North Atlantic, you're missing the biggest part of the story. Their trade network was a sprawling, intercontinental operation that funneled goods and silver from the bustling markets of Baghdad all the way to the fledgling settlements of Newfoundland, making them the unlikely pioneers of globalization. This commercial empire operated on two massive parallel axes. To the west, their ships crossed the Atlantic to places like Markland, modern-day Labrador, where they harvested what was arguably one of their most sought-after commodities, timber. For settlers in nearly treeless Greenland and Iceland, a load of strong, straight lumber was worth a fortune, but the real luxury goods came from the far north. From the Sami people in what is now northern Norway and Sweden, the Vikings obtained incredibly thick, luxurious furs, Arctic fox, bear, and sable that were in high demand across Europe. Even more valuable was walrus ivory, hunted from the icy waters around Greenland. walrus tusks were a perfect substitute for elephant ivory, which was nearly impossible to obtain in Europe at the time. This narwhal tooth, as it was sometimes called, was carved into exquisite religious items like crucifixes and bishops' croziers, as well as into intricate gaming pieces and jewelry for the elite, becoming a status symbol across the continent. But the Western trade was just one half of the story. The real economic engine, the source of nearly all the silver that fueled their entire economy, lay to the east and south. This was the Durham route. Viking traders and adventurers, known as the Rus, from which we get the name Russia, sailed their longships down the immense river systems of Eastern Europe, the Dnieper and the Volga. Their destination was the Caspian and Black Seas, and beyond that, the fabulously wealthy Abbasid Caliphate centered in Baghdad. The Caliphate's economy was built on silver, and they minted millions of pristine, high-quality silver coins called dirhams. The Vikings had what the Caliphate wanted, goods that could only be sourced from the north. They traded those furs, those magnificent walrus tusks, and tragically, human captives taken in raids throughout Europe. The scale of this slave trade, or thrall trade as they called it, was immense and formed a dark foundation for their prosperity. The word slave itself actually derives from Slav, because so many people taken from the Slavic regions of Eastern Europe were sold into bondage by Viking traders. These human beings were exchanged in markets from Scandinavia to Baghdad for the one thing the Vikings craved above all else: silver. They returned from these epic journeys with their ships groaning under the weight of chests filled with Arabic coins. This influx of silver was so enormous that it fundamentally reshaped the entire Scandinavian economy. They didn't even bother to melt most of it down to make their own currency. They simply hacked the coins into pieces to be weighed on small, portable scales for day-to-day transactions. The evidence for this is everywhere. Over 200,000 Arabic dirhams have been discovered in hoards across Sweden alone, with more found every year. Imagine a Swedish farmer in the 10th century buying a new cow by carefully weighing out a few pieces of a silver coin minted in a Baghdad marketplace thousands of miles away, a coin that had passed through the hands of Norse, Slavic, and Arabic traders. It's a breathtaking picture of a connected medieval world. The flow of goods and people wasn't just one way. As Viking traders penetrated deeper into the East, they left their mark in the most surprising places. In the great city of Constantinople, the capital of the Byzantine Empire, the Norse presence was so significant that the emperors employed an entire elite guard composed entirely of Viking mercenaries. These were the Varangian Guard, the personal bodyguards of the Byzantine emperor, famed for their loyalty and their fierce battle axes. But beyond the guard, Norse artifacts have turned up in Istanbul, ancient Constantinople, including a piece of runestone with an inscription that may have been a Viking merchant's attempt to carve his name so far from home. The ultimate symbol of this eastward reach, however, comes from a small island in Lake Mälaren, Sweden, called Helgö. Archaeologists excavating a trading center there found something that left them utterly stunned: a small bronze Buddha statue from northern India. Sitting in the classic meditation pose, the statue was likely manufactured in the region of Kashmir in the 6th century, then traveled thousands of miles overland and by river before finally being traded to a Norse merchant, perhaps in a market on the Volga River, who then brought it all the way back to Sweden. This one small artifact, sitting calmly in a Scandinavian museum today, perfectly encapsulates the mind-boggling scale of the Viking world. It wasn't a series of isolated raids. It was a vast, interconnected economic system that moved everything from slaves to statues, linking the fjords of Norway to the deserts of Arabia in a relentless pursuit of wealth and influence. Yet for all their far-reaching trade and exploration, none of it would have been possible without a single revolutionary invention that literally launched their entire age. We often think of the Viking Age as beginning with a sudden explosion of violence, like the infamous raid on Lindisfarne in 793. But that raid wasn't the cause of their expansion, it was merely a symptom. The true catalyst, the spark that ignited 3 centuries of transformation, was a quiet revolution in technology happening in shipyards across Scandinavia. The Vikings didn't just decide to start raiding, they perfected a machine that made it inevitable. At the heart of this revolution was the longship, but not just any boat. This was a masterpiece of maritime engineering, a vessel so perfectly adapted to its purpose that it has few equals in history. Its most genius feature was its revolutionary clinker-built construction. Unlike the carvel-built ships of the Mediterranean, where planks are laid edge to edge on a rigid frame, Viking shipbuilders started with the shell. They overlapped sturdy oak planks known as strakes and riveted them together with iron nails. This created a hull that was not just strong but incredibly flexible. In the brutal, ice-choked waters of the North Atlantic, a rigid ship would be pounded to pieces by the waves. A longship, however, could flex and move with the sea, riding the swells like a living creature. It was this resilience that allowed them to venture where others dared not go. This flexibility was matched by a brilliantly shallow draft. The hull of a longship sat barely 3 feet deep in the water. This seems like a minor detail, but it was their ultimate strategic weapon. It meant that a Viking raiding party could sail up any river, no matter how narrow or shallow. They could cross vast, open oceans and then slide effortlessly onto a beach without needing a deep water port. Most terrifyingly for the monasteries and towns of Europe, they could travel deep inland, appearing suddenly and without warning hundreds of miles from the coast. A French monk writing in the 9th century captured this sheer terror perfectly in his prayer. "From the fury of the Northmen, O Lord, deliver us." Their ships were the delivery system for that fury, able to strike at the very heart of a kingdom with shocking speed. That speed was another key to their success. These ships were dual-powered. When the wind was favorable, they could raise a large, square woolen sail, often dyed a striking red to create an intimidating sight. But when navigating tricky rivers or during calm spells, the crew of 30 to 50 warriors would man the oars. This combination made them weather-proof and incredibly versatile. They were not at the mercy of the elements, they could use them. A Viking fleet could cover astonishing distances, up to 200 miles in a single day under ideal conditions, a speed that made early warning and defense nearly impossible for their victims. The societal impact of this technology cannot be overstated. Shipbuilding was the high-tech industry of its day, requiring immense skill, vast quantities of high-quality timber, and a deep understanding of seamanship. Owning a longship was a symbol of immense prestige and power, the equivalent of owning a private jet today. It created a new class of elite warriors and merchants who could mobilize men and wealth independently of kings. This technological leap didn't just enable the Viking Age. It created the very social and economic conditions that defined it, turning local chieftains into international power brokers and setting the stage for an era of unprecedented exploration and change. But beyond the roar of battle and the creak of oars, the Vikings left behind another, more subtle legacy etched not in history books but in stone, wood, and bone. Theirs was a world rich with communication, record-keeping, and a deep-seated belief in the power of the written word, all channeled through a beautifully stark and angular alphabet known as the rune. We often picture them as illiterate barbarians, but the truth is they possessed a complex writing system that wove together the mundane and the mystical in a way few other cultures have. This system was the Younger Futhark, the essential Viking Age script. The word Futhark itself comes from the first 6 letters of this runic alphabet, much like our alphabet comes from alpha and beta. It was a streamlined version of an older, more complex Germanic system, perfectly adapted for carving. With only 16 characters, it was an efficient and versatile tool. Each rune wasn't just a letter, it was a concept, a symbol loaded with meaning. The rune Fe, for instance, represented the F sound, but its name meant cattle or wealth, the very foundation of their economy. Was the U sound, but it meant rain or slag, pointing to the importance of weather and ironworking. This dual nature made every inscription more than just text. It was a layer of meaning waiting to be unlocked. You can find these runic messages in the most extraordinary places. The most dramatic are the rune stones, massive granite monuments raised by grieving families, often along well-traveled roads. These weren't just simple tombstones, they were public announcements of love, loss, and legacy. A typical inscription might read, "Gunnar raised this stone in memory of Bjorn, his brother, a very good warrior." But they also served as legal documents declaring inheritance or even boasting of incredible deeds, like the runestone that proudly states a man named Ingvar led an expedition all the way to the land of the Saracens. Yet for every grand runestone, there were 1,000 smaller, more intimate inscriptions that reveal the true depth of runic use in daily life. In the bustling trading town of Briggen in Norway, archaeologists have recovered hundreds of rune-carved wooden sticks from the medieval period. These were the post-it notes of the Viking Age. One might be a simple business receipt. Thorkel owns a debt of 3 silver coins. Another could be a heartfelt love message, "Kiss me, my darling." We find personal names carved into beautifully crafted bone combs, the owner declaring, "Thorfast made a good comb." There are even cheeky boasts on gaming pieces, like the king piece that declares, "I am the king," right on its base. This wasn't a writing system reserved for priests and kings. It was a practical skill used by merchants, craftspeople, lovers, and travelers to navigate their world. But to believe runes were only for practical messages is to miss half their power. The word rune itself comes from the Old Norse run, meaning secret or mystery, and they were deeply entwined with magic and the divine. According to their mythology, the chief god Odin underwent a terrifying ordeal to win this knowledge for humanity, hanging himself from the world tree Yggdrasil for 9 days and nights, pierced by his own spear, in order to grasp the secrets of the runes. This sacrifice imbued the symbols with immense supernatural significance. A rune master, or Arilaz, wasn't just a scribe, he was a wielder of hidden forces. He would carve specific runes onto objects to alter their nature. A healing rune, like Bjarkan for rebirth, might be carved onto a piece of wood and placed under a sick person's bed to aid their recovery. A victory rune, named for the god of war, could be etched onto a sword blade to ensure it found its mark in battle. Protective runes were inscribed on amulets and around doorways to ward off evil spirits and misfortune. Perhaps the most chilling were the curse runes, designed to bring illness, bad luck, or even death to an enemy. This belief in the literal power of the word, that shaping a symbol could shape reality, shows a worldview where writing was not a passive record but an active, potent force. Every stroke of the knife was an act of creation, communication, or conjuration, making the Viking relationship with their alphabet one of the most profound and fascinating in history. Of course, the assumption that every fearsome Viking warrior was a man is another misconception we need to lay to rest. This idea doesn't just come from modern storytelling. It's deeply rooted in the way archaeology itself was conducted for over a century. When a grave was discovered filled with swords, axes, shields, and armor, the immediate, unquestioned conclusion was that it belonged to a male warrior. This bias was so ingrained that it blinded generations of researchers to a truth that was literally lying right in front of them. The story of the Burka warrior, known as Grave BJ 581, is the most powerful example of why we must constantly question our assumptions about the past. Discovered in the late 1800s at Burka, a major Viking trading hub in Sweden, this grave was a textbook example of a high-status military commander's burial. The body was laid to rest in a seated position, surrounded by an incredible arsenal: a sword, an axe, a fighting knife, 2 shields, a quiver full of armor-piercing arrows, and the bones of 2 horses. But the most telling items weren't just the weapons, they were the tools of strategy. The grave contained a full set of gaming pieces and a board used for Hnefataffel, a chess-like game of military tactics. This wasn't just a brute force fighter, this was a person who planned battles, who thought several moves ahead, a respected strategist. For more than 100 years, no one ever doubted they were studying the remains of a powerful man. That all changed in 2017. A team of researchers at Stockholm University decided to use modern science to settle lingering questions about the genetic origins of people buried in Burka. They extracted ancient DNA from a tooth and a humerus bone from skeleton BJ 581. The analysis was unequivocal. The chromosomes were Roman 20. The high-ranking professional warrior, buried with every honor befitting a military leader, was biologically female. The announcement sent shockwaves through the archaeological community and forced a monumental rethink of Viking Age society. This discovery forces us to confront the literal evidence found in the Norse sagas themselves. These epic tales, written down later but based on older oral traditions, occasionally speak of shield maidens, women who chose the path of the warrior. Historians had long debated these accounts, often dismissing them as mythological fantasies, symbolic characters, or perhaps just rare exceptions. The Burka warrior proves they were not myths. Here was tangible, scientific proof that at least one woman not only fought but achieved a position of high command. Her strategic acumen valued so highly that she was buried with the tools of her trade. It suggests that the path of the warrior, while undoubtedly dominated by men, was not an exclusively male domain. This doesn't mean every Viking woman was a fighter, of course. But it does shatter the simplistic image of women confined solely to the domestic sphere. The Burka grave provides a powerful testament to the possibility of female agency in a warrior culture. It tells us that in Viking society, your status and how you were buried were determined by your role, your achievements, and your identity in life, not solely by your gender. This one grave, with its silent bones and eloquent grave goods, challenges us to see the Viking world as more complex, more nuanced, and far more interesting than the old stereotypes ever allowed. Now, if the runes show us the Vikings were sophisticated communicators, their political innovations reveal a society grappling with ideas of law and order on a scale that would echo through the centuries. We often picture them as anarchic raiders, loyal only to their chieftain and their crew, but in at least one corner of their world, they were building something revolutionary, one of the earliest known parliamentary systems in human history. This didn't happen in the power centers of Norway or Denmark, but on the rugged, remote island of Iceland, a place that itself was a product of Viking defiance and independence. The story begins with the settlement of Iceland in the late 9th century. The people who braved the North Atlantic to build a new life there were, by and large, free landholders and their families, chafing under the growing power of a single king, Harald Fairhair, in Norway. They were fiercely independent individuals who had no intention of simply replacing one monarch with another. This created a unique societal challenge. With no central authority, how would they prevent blood feuds from tearing their new communities apart? How would they settle disputes over stolen livestock, contested land borders, or even murders? They needed a system, a law of the land that was decided by the land, not dictated by a crown. The solution they crafted was the Althing, established in the year 930. The word itself, Althingi, means the General Assembly, and it was a breathtakingly ambitious project. Imagine the sheer logistical feat. Once a year, for 2 weeks in the sunny month of June, every free and law-worthy man in Iceland was expected to travel to a specific, dramatic location in the southwest of the country, Thingvellir. This was no small journey. For some, it meant weeks of travel on horseback or by foot across treacherous glaciers, raging rivers, and vast lava fields. They came because this was the social, political, and legal heart of the entire nation. This annual gathering was the Viking world's greatest convention. The setting itself was profoundly symbolic. Thingvellir is a rift valley, a deep canyon where the North American and Eurasian tectonic plates are slowly pulling apart. The meeting was held on a great rocky outcrop called the Law Rock Lurgberg, which acted as a natural amphitheater. It was here that the law speaker, the most important official in the land, would preside. Elected for a 3-year term, his job was monumental. In a society without written law codes at first, he had to memorize the entire body of Icelandic law and recite 1/3 of it aloud each year from the Law Rock, ensuring every citizen knew their rights and responsibilities. His voice, echoing off the canyon walls, was the living law of the land, but the Althing was far more than just a recitation. It was a fully functioning legislature and a supreme court. The core of its power lay in the participation of the local chieftains, known as Garðar. These were men of influence who held a hereditary title called a Garðorð, which wasn't ownership of land, but rather the right to bring a certain number of followers to the assembly. It was a system built on persuasion and consensus, not raw coercion. At the Althing, these chieftains and their followers would form the Lögrétta, the Law Council. They would debate and pass new laws, amend old ones, and set national policy. In nearby fields, a bustling temporary city of turf-built booths would spring up where merchants would trade, families would reunite, news would be shared, and marriages would be arranged. It was the complete integration of a nation's life. For individual citizens, the Althing was their courthouse. If you had a grievance against your neighbor, this was your chance for justice. You would present your case before the assembled quarter court relevant to your region. There were no lawyers, no professional judges. Your chances rested on your ability to argue persuasively and, crucially, on the support of witnesses and the backing of a powerful chieftain. The courts could issue rulings, impose fines, and even sentence individuals to outlawry, the most terrifying punishment of all. To be declared an outlaw meant you were placed outside the protection of the law. Your property was forfeit, and you could be killed by anyone without consequence, forcing you to flee into the wilderness or escape the country entirely. It was a brutal system, but it was a system, a structured alternative to the endless cycle of violence and vengeance. The legacy of the Althing is not just a historical footnote, it is a living, breathing institution. While its power was curtailed after Iceland came under Norwegian rule in the 13th century, it never truly ceased to exist. In 1844, as Iceland was awakening to a new sense of national identity, the Althing was reconvened as an advisory council, and in 1944, when Iceland declared its full independence from Denmark, it did so at the sacred site of Thingvellir. Today, the modern Icelandic parliament still bears the ancient name Alþingi, making it the oldest surviving parliament in the world. This Viking invention, born from a desire for self-governance and the rule of law, stands as a powerful testament to a side of Norse culture we rarely celebrate: their profound capacity to build, to organize, and to create a society where free men had a voice. It was a radical experiment in collective decision-making that continues to inspire 800 years later. While our modern imagination often reduces Norse mythology to the thunderous hammer of Thor and the one-eyed gaze of Odin, the spiritual world of the Vikings was a breathtakingly vast and intricate cosmos, a metaphysical map far richer than just a simple pantheon of gods. This was a universe humming with interconnected life, where every tree, river, and stone could hold a spirit, and where the destiny of all things was woven by unseen hands. To truly understand a Viking's view of existence, we must journey beyond the halls of Asgard and into the sprawling, interconnected web of the Nine Worlds, all held together by the great world tree itself. This entire cosmic structure was supported by Yggdrasil, the immense and sacred ash tree. Its name, which translates ominously to Odin's horse, a reference to the god's self-sacrifice where he hung from its branches, hints at its profound and terrible power. Yggdrasil was not just a tree, it was the axis of the universe, the central pillar connecting all realms of existence. Its three great roots stretched down into three separate wells, each a source of immense power and knowledge. One root reached the well of Erd, where the Norns dwelt. Another extended into the spring of Mimir, a well of cosmic wisdom for which Odin sacrificed his eye. The third delved into the chaotic, roaring spring of Virgilmere in Niflheim, the source of all the rivers in the world. The tree itself was constantly under siege, nibbled by 4 stags, a goat, and the malevolent dragon Nidhogg, who gnawed at its roots, a powerful symbol of the constant struggle between order and chaos that defined their entire worldview. Perched within the branches and among the roots of Yggdrasil were the 9 worlds, the homes of all beings. Asgard, of course, was the realm of the Aesir gods, like Odin and Thor, connected to the human world of Midgard by the shimmering rainbow bridge Bifrost. But the gods did not live alone. There was Vanaheim, the home of the older, fertility-oriented Vanir gods like Freya and Freyja, who were associated with magic and prosperity. Elfheim was the luminous world of the Light Elves, beautiful and benevolent beings closely connected to the gods. In stark contrast, Svartalfheim was the cavernous, subterranean home of the dwarves, master smiths and craftsmen who forged the gods' greatest treasures, including Thor's hammer Mjolnir and Odin's ring Draupnir. Then there was Jotunheim, a harsh, mountainous land of the giants, the eternal foes of the gods who represented the untamed, destructive forces of nature. For the dead, there were multiple destinations. Those who died bravely in battle were chosen by the Valkyries to feast forever in Odin's hall Valhalla, while those who died at sea or of old age might find themselves in the watery hall of the goddess Ran. The treacherous, dishonorable dead were cast into Niflheim, a frozen land of mist and darkness ruled by the goddess Hel. This cosmology was populated by an entire ecosystem of beings who were neither fully god nor fully mortal. The dwarves, as we've seen, were crucial artisans. The elves were powerful nature spirits who could bring fertility or illness to a community, and offerings were commonly left for them at so-called elf stones or small altars. Giants were not just stupid brutes, they were ancient primeval beings of immense power and cunning, often the source of great wisdom as well as great conflict. Even the dead were not entirely gone. They could remain as land spirits or Disir, looked to for protection and guidance by their living families. This belief made the Viking world a deeply animate and spiritually crowded place, where one had to be mindful of countless unseen forces in daily life. Overarching this entire complex system was the inescapable concept of weird. This Old Norse term is often simplistically translated as fate, but it was something far more active and interwoven. Unlike the Greek concept of fate, which was a predetermined path spun by 3 distant goddesses, weird was more like a vast, ever-tightening web of cause and effect, of actions and their consequences. Every choice a person made, every promise kept, every oath broken, every act of courage or cowardice added a new thread to this web, pulling the future into a certain shape. The 3 Norns, Erd what once was, Verdandi what is coming into being, and Skuld what shall be, sat at the well of Erd beneath Yggdrasil. They did not just dictate fate, they constantly wove the tapestry of weird, incorporating the actions of both gods and mortals into its pattern. This belief did not lead to a passive acceptance of destiny. Instead, it placed a tremendous emphasis on personal honor and the consequences of one's actions. A Viking knew that their deeds would resonate through the web of weird, affecting their family's fortune for generations to come. To die well with courage and integrity was to strengthen one's personal thread and the honor of one's lineage, ensuring a good reputation that would outlive the body. In this spiritual framework, life was not a journey toward a heavenly reward but a performance on a cosmic stage, where the goal was to live a story so brave and honorable that the Norns would weave it forever into the very fabric of the universe. This prosperity, this vast network of trade that spanned continents, had a dark and brutal foundation. For every silver dirham gleaming in a merchant's chest, for every luxurious sable pelt traded in Baghdad, there was a profound human cost. The Viking economic miracle was built on the backs of a massive, oppressed underclass, the thralls. Slavery was not a minor aspect of their society. It was an indispensable pillar, a brutal industry that fueled their entire way of life and constituted what historians estimate was up to a quarter of the entire population in some Norse territories. These individuals, known as thralls, were the absolute bottom rung of a strictly hierarchical society. They were not citizens, they were property, legally equivalent to livestock. A thrall was obtained in several ways. The most common was through violent capture during the raids that made the Vikings infamous. A successful Viking expedition was not just about grabbing gold and silver, it was also about taking people. Coastal villages from Ireland to France and deep into the Slavic lands of Eastern Europe lived in terror of these sudden attacks, knowing that capture meant a life of brutal servitude in a foreign land. Many others entered slavery through trade, as human beings were one of the most valuable commodities moving along the Viking trade routes. The very word slave itself is a chilling linguistic relic of this practice, derived from Slav, because so many people taken from Slavic regions were sold into bondage by Norse traders. A third method was through debt or as punishment for a crime. A free person could be forced into temporary thrall status to settle what they owed. Once enslaved, a thrall's life was one of relentless toil and complete powerlessness. They performed the most difficult, backbreaking labor that the free Norsemen wanted to avoid. They cleared land for farms, cut peat for fuel, tended to livestock, ground grain, and performed all the domestic chores. They were the invisible engine that freed the landowning class, the Karla, to pursue raiding, trading, and politics. A wealthy Viking status was measured not just in his land and silver, but in the number of thralls he owned. Their existence was precarious in the extreme. They could be bought, sold, gambled away, or given as gifts at their owner's whim. They had no right to own property, could not marry without their master's consent, and any children they had were born into slavery, becoming the property of the owner. Physical punishment was commonplace and severe. The law codes that offered so much protection to free men and women offered none to thralls. If a master killed his own thrall, it was considered a simple matter of property damage, akin to destroying his own axe, and might only incur a minor fine. If someone else killed another man's thrall, the compensation paid was not for the life lost, but to reimburse the owner for the lost property. The evidence for this is etched into the language and literature they left behind. The sagas are filled with casual, unflinching references to thralls, revealing how normalized the institution was. Archaeological finds also tell a summer story. While high-status free Vikings were buried with their weapons and jewelry to take to the afterlife, thralls were often disposed of with little more ceremony than an animal, sometimes even buried face down, a practice perhaps intended to prevent their spirits from returning to haunt the living. The sheer scale of this practice is staggering. Some estimates suggest that during the height of the Viking Age, as many as 1 in every 4 people in the Norse world was a thrall. This wasn't a minor injustice, it was a fundamental, systemic feature of their society, an engine of economic production that created the surplus wealth necessary for the raids, the trade voyages, and the lavish lifestyles of the elite. It is a stark and necessary reminder that the Viking Age, for all its tales of exploration and adventure, was also an age of immense human suffering, a chapter of history built upon a foundation of brutal, industrialized oppression. But this complex world of gods and giants, of trade and law, was not just the domain of adults. From their earliest years, Viking children were being subtly, and sometimes quite literally, steered toward the roles they were expected to fulfill in their highly structured society. We might imagine a Viking childhood as harsh and short, devoid of any frivolity, but archaeological discoveries paint a more nuanced picture. one where play was not just encouraged but was a vital form of training, even if that meant the toys themselves could be surprisingly perilous. The most common finds in excavation sites linked to Viking children are miniature versions of adult tools and weapons. It wasn't uncommon for a young boy to have his own small wooden sword, a tiny axe, or a little shield, all expertly crafted to mimic the real things his father and older brothers carried. These weren't crude sticks, they were often carefully shaped and smoothed, sometimes even decorated with simple carvings. For girls, archaeologists have found miniature versions of household items, small wooden distaffs for spinning wool, tiny ceramic pots, and little bronze brooches. This seems like simple mimicry, a way for children to imitate their parents, but it was far more intentional. Through this type of play, children were unconsciously rehearsing and mastering the skills they would need for the rest of their lives. A boy practicing with his wooden sword was developing the muscle memory and coordination for the shield wall. A girl playing with a small loom was learning the intricate patterns and techniques of textile work, a hugely important and valuable skill in Norse culture. This blurring of the line between plaything and training tool becomes even starker when we look at the evidence from graves. While many children were buried with their small wooden toys, some graves reveal a much more sobering reality. There are several excavated burials of boys, some as young as 8 or 9 years old, who were laid to rest not with carvings, but with real, fully functional weapons that had been scaled down to fit their smaller stature. We have found graves containing iron axe heads with shorter hafts, seekers a single-edged fighting knife with smaller handles, and even bows that a child could actually draw. These were not toys, these were the weapons of a warrior in training. This practice tells us that for some Viking children, particularly those from high-status families expected to produce leaders and fighters, childhood was a truncated period. Their play was serious business, a direct preparation for a life of conflict and responsibility. The possession of a real weapon signified that the boy was already on the path to becoming a Drenga, a young warrior who would soon be expected to join raids and prove his courage. The presence of these weapons in a grave is deeply poignant. It signifies that the community recognized and honored this intended path, even for a life cut tragically short. They were burying not just a child, but the warrior he was destined to become. Of course, not all play was so overtly dangerous or vocational. Children are children in any era, and the archaeological record is also full of simpler, more universal amusements. Animal knucklebones, likely used in a game similar to jacks, have been found in abundance. Simple wooden tops carved with patterns that would create a spinning blur were common. Evidence of ball games, probably played with a stitched leather ball stuffed with wool or hay, points to active physical play. But even these simpler games had a purpose beyond mere fun. A game of knucklebones improved dexterity and counting skills. A competitive ball game built strength, agility, and teamwork, all essential traits for a Viking, whether they were heading out on a longship or managing a busy farmstead. This approach to childhood reveals a society that viewed the next generation as its most vital resource, and every moment, even play, was an opportunity to invest in a child's future, and by extension, the future strength of the family and the community itself. Yet for all their focus on training the next generation in the arts of war and work, the Vikings cultivated another, more refined skill that was held in the highest esteem, one that could earn a man as much renown as any battle victory. In the great halls of chieftains and kings, amidst the roar of the fire and the clinking of drinking horns, another kind of power was being wielded. This was the power of the word, crafted into intricate, mesmerizing verses that could immortalize a leader, curse an enemy, or preserve the history of a people. To the Viking mind, a beautifully composed poem was a weapon as potent as a well-forged sword, and the person who could create it, the skald, was a figure of immense prestige and influence. This revered art form was known as skaldic poetry, and it was arguably one of the most complex and demanding literary traditions ever developed. Unlike the older, more narrative-etic poetry which told the stories of the gods and heroes in a relatively straightforward manner, skaldic verse was a high-stakes game of intellectual and linguistic brilliance, performed for a live audience of nobles and warriors who were themselves connoisseurs of the form. A skald's performance was not mere entertainment, it was a verbal feat of strength. The core of this complexity lay in a system of metaphorical riddles called kennings. A kenning is a two-part phrase that describes something in an indirect, often beautiful, and always clever way. The sea wasn't just the sea, it was the whale road. A battle was the storm of swords, blood became dew of wounds, gold was the fire of the sea. But a master skald didn't stop there. He would layer kennings within kennings, creating a dizzying puzzle for the listener to unravel. A simple phrase like "the feeder of ravens" means a warrior as he provides food for the birds of battle. But a truly skilled poet might call a warrior the generous feeder of the wound sea's swan. Where wound sea is blood, the swan of blood is the raven, and the feeder of that raven is the warrior. To compose this on the spot and to decode it while listening required a nimble mind and a deep knowledge of mythology and tradition. The social role of the court skald was therefore one of immense importance. A powerful king like Harald Fairhair in Norway or Eric Bloodaxe in Northumbria would keep a skald in his retinue, much like he would keep a master swordsman. The skald's job was to compose and recite poems that celebrated the king's deeds, ensuring his bravery, generosity, and power would be remembered for all time. In a culture with a deep-seated fear of being forgotten, the concept of Odethleg freight or immortal news, this was a sacred duty. A great poem was a monument more lasting than any runestone. But this relationship was a delicate one. The skald walked a fine line between flattery and criticism. His verses, while celebratory, were also expected to be true. A poem that was seen as overly sycophantic or worse, factually inaccurate, would disgrace both the poet and the king. The skald had to be a historian, a public relations expert, and a wordsmith all at once. The respect afforded to a master skald was genuinely comparable to that of a legendary warrior. The sagas are filled with stories where a perfectly delivered poem could save a man's life. In one famous tale, the skald Egil Skallagrimsson, a formidable warrior in his own right, finds himself captured by his bitter enemy, King Eirik Bloodaxe, who has every intention of having him executed. As a last resort, Egil does what he does best. He stays up all night composing a magnificent 20-stanza poem called Herfadlosson, or Head Ransom. The next morning, he recites the Droppa, a poem of praise, so flawlessly and with such skill that the delighted and impressed King Eirik has no choice but to grant him his life. In this instance, the poem was literally worth more than its weight in gold. It was worth the poet's head. This story powerfully illustrates that in Viking culture, intellectual prowess could triumph over brute force. A well-turned verse could resolve a conflict, secure a rich reward of gold and silver rings from a pleased lord, or cement a legacy that would echo through the centuries. It reveals a society that, for all its well-deserved reputation for violence, possessed a sophisticated appreciation for art, wit, and the sublime power of language, proving that the pen, or in this case, the well-honed tongue, could indeed be mightier than the sword. Their mastery of the sword and the axe was undeniable, but the Vikings understood that the most potent weapon in any conflict is the one wielded against the mind. Long before a single blow was struck, they were already working to secure victory by systematically dismantling the morale of their enemies, crafting a reputation so terrifying that it could cause armies to fracture and towns to surrender without a fight. This was psychological warfare, a calculated and brutally effective strategy designed to paralyze their opponents with fear. The foundation of this strategy was the meticulous construction of their infamous reputation. They weren't just random bands of raiders, they were authors of their own legend, and they understood the power of narrative. After a successful raid on a poorly defended monastery or a coastal village, they would often allow a few survivors to escape. These traumatized witnesses would then spread the story of the attack far and wide, their tales growing more horrific with each retelling. The Vikings became the monsters in the dark, a nameless, faceless horror from the sea that could strike anywhere, anytime. Chroniclers in England and France, many of them monks, became unwitting publicists for this campaign of terror, filling their manuscripts with vivid accounts of the heathens' brutality, their desecration of holy sites, and their seemingly inhuman strength. The Vikings didn't just accept this monstrous image, they cultivated it, knowing that a fearful enemy is already half defeated. This orchestrated aura of menace was reinforced by a simple yet incredibly powerful visual cue: their ships. The iconic dragon-headed prow, the Dreki, was not just for show. As a longship approached a distant shore, that carved beast emerging from the mist was the first sign of impending doom. But perhaps even more effective was the rumor, widely believed across Europe, that the Vikings sailed under black sails. While the archaeological evidence for this is debated, sails were made of wool and rarely survived. The belief itself was a potent psychological tool. A dark sail on the horizon meant only one thing: death had arrived. The sight would trigger panic, sending farmers scrambling from their fields and villagers rushing to barricade their doors long before the warriors ever landed. It was a branding exercise in sheer terror, making their arrival an event unto itself. The ultimate embodiment of this psychological campaign, the living weapon of fear, was the berserker. These warriors have been mythologized for centuries, but their existence is supported by multiple saga accounts and legal codes that specifically outlawed going berserk. They weren't just exceptionally angry fighters, they were part of a likely ritualized warrior cult dedicated to the god Odin. The name itself offers a clue. Berserker is often translated as bear shirt, suggesting these men fought wearing the pelts of bears, while another term, ulfhithna, means wolf skins. By wearing the skins of these powerful, wild animals, they sought to take on the spirit and ferocity of the beast itself in battle. Historical sources describe them entering a trance-like state of battle fury. Their eyes would roll back in their heads, they would foam at the mouth, and they would howl and gnaw on the rims of their shields. They were said to feel no pain, to possess inhuman strength, and to be immune to fire and iron. In this frenzy, they would charge enemy lines alone, a whirlwind of uncontrolled violence that could break a shield wall through sheer, terrifying unpredictability. To a Christian army who believed in order and disciplined formation, the sight of a seemingly possessed, inhumanly strong maniac charging them without any regard for his own safety was utterly petrifying. It shattered the very concept of a fair fight. While the exact cause of this frenzy is still debated, theories range from ritualized chanting and dance to the deliberate consumption of hallucinogenic substances like henbane or psychedelic mushrooms. The effect was undeniable. The berserker was not just a fighter, he was a tactical weapon of mass disruption, whose primary role was to inject chaos and primal fear into the heart of the enemy before the main battle had even begun. This calculated projection of terror, from whispered rumors to the very real spectacle of the beast-like warrior, gave the Vikings an advantage that was every bit as decisive as any sword. While their fearsome reputation often precedes them, the true measure of Viking power wasn't just in how they wielded their weapons, but in their extraordinary skill at creating them. This was a culture that mastered fire and metal with an expertise that left much of Europe in the dust, producing blades of such legendary quality that they were believed to possess magical properties. Their secret wasn't just brute force, it was a sophisticated understanding of metallurgy that turned simple iron into the finest swords of the early medieval world. The pinnacle of this art was the pattern-welded sword, a weapon so advanced it seems almost supernatural. Forging a great Viking sword wasn't as simple as hammering out a single piece of steel. Instead, it was a grueling, weeks-long process that resembled a form of high-temperature baking. The blacksmith would begin by creating multiple rods of iron and carburized iron, which is a primitive form of steel with a higher carbon content. These rods were then twisted together like a piece of rope while they were white-hot, and then hammer forged into a single, solid bar. This process of twisting and forging was repeated over and over, layering the different metals dozens of times. The result was a core for the blade composed of hundreds of micro-thin layers of hard and soft metal fused into one. This intricate layering was the genius of the design. The softer, more flexible iron prevented the blade from becoming brittle and snapping in the heat of battle, while the harder, high-carbon steel edges could be honed to a razor-sharp, durable finish that would hold its edge through combat. But the true magic was revealed only after the final polish and etching. The different metals in the twisted core reacted differently to acid, revealing a stunning, swirling pattern on the surface of the blade that looked like flowing water, misty clouds, or the coils of a serpent. This wasn't just decoration, it was the visible proof of the blade's complex, layered soul, a mark of its superior quality and strength. To a Viking warrior, this mesmerizing pattern was evidence that the sword was not merely a tool, but a living entity with its own spirit, a weapon worthy of a name and a saga. This metallurgical mastery extended far beyond the battlefield and into the realm of personal adornment. The same hands that could forge a deadly pattern-welded sword could also produce jewelry of breathtaking intricacy. Using techniques like filigree, where fine threads of silver and gold were twisted and soldered into delicate patterns, and granulation, where tiny metal beads were fused onto a surface to create texture and design, Viking artisans created brooches, arm rings, and pendants that were miniature works of art. The purpose of this jewelry was twofold. Practically, items like the large oval brooches worn by women served to fasten their aprons' dresses, but they were also a portable form of wealth and a powerful display of status. A man's worth could be literally worn on his sleeve in the form of twisted silver arm rings, which could also be hacked apart to make payments in the silver weight economy. The skill required to work with such precious materials on such a small scale shows a level of artistic sophistication and technical control that completely contradicts the image of the Vikings as mere brutes. What made this all the more impressive was their ability to do this with limited local resources. Scandinavia is not rich in high-quality iron ore deposits. Their innovation lay in their ability to work with what they had, primarily bog iron. This is a type of iron that forms in peat bogs from the action of bacteria on iron in the water. Viking smiths would harvest these rusty, lumpy nodules of bog iron and smelt them in a bloomery furnace, a clay chimney that used charcoal to burn at temperatures high enough to separate the pure iron from the waste rock or slag. The result was a bloom, a spongy mass of iron that had to be repeatedly heated and hammered to remove impurities. It was a labor-intensive, dirty process, but it provided the raw material for an empire. Their ability to transform this common, low-grade material into both world-class weaponry and exquisite art through sheer skill and process innovation is perhaps their most lasting and impressive secret, proving that their greatest strength was not in their arms but in their minds. Now, let's shatter another stereotype, the idea of the Viking as a brute who lived on nothing but mead and tough, roasted meat. While a hearty feast was certainly central to their culture, the reality of the Viking diet was far more sophisticated, varied, and surprisingly healthy than you might imagine. Archaeological evidence from sites across the Viking world reveals a culinary landscape that was rich with diverse flavors, sophisticated preservation techniques, and even a taste for imported luxuries that connected their dinner plates to a global trade network. At its heart, the Viking diet was built on a foundation of self-sufficiency, expertly tailored to survive the long, harsh Scandinavian winters. The backbone of their nutrition came from grains, primarily barley, rye, and oats. These weren't just for bread, they were boiled into thick, hearty porridges that provided essential calories and nutrients. They cultivated a variety of vegetables as well, including cabbages, onions, peas, beans, and carrots, which provided vital vitamins and could be stored for months. For protein, they were masters of animal husbandry, raising cattle, sheep, goats, and pigs. But they were also opportunistic and resourceful hunters, supplementing their larders with venison, elk, wild boar, and every manner of fowl from ducks to grouse. Their true genius, however, lay in their mastery of preservation. In a world without refrigeration, ensuring a stable food supply through the winter was a matter of life and death. They became experts in techniques like drying, smoking, salting, and fermenting. Fish, which was abundant, was air-dried to make stockfish, a rock-hard staple that could be stored for years and then pounded back to an edible state. Meat was smoked in the rafters of their longhouses or preserved in whey, a byproduct of cheese-making. They even fermented fish to create a pungent sauce similar to the Roman garum, a powerful condiment used to flavor their meals. Dairy was another crucial element, not just as fresh milk but transformed into skaya, a protein-rich yogurt-like cheese, and long-lasting butter that was often stored in boggy ground to keep it cool and acquire a strong, distinctive flavor that modern palates might find challenging. The most astonishing evidence of their sophisticated palate, however, comes from the most unexpected of places: the microscopic analysis of soil and cooking residues from Viking age trash pits and cooking pots. In the bustling trading town of Birka, Sweden, and at the fortress of Trelleborg in Denmark, archaeologists have found traces of spices that could not possibly have been grown locally. They discovered the chemical fingerprints of cumin, coriander, and even the seeds of the mustard plant. These spices originated thousands of miles away in the warm climates of the Mediterranean and the Middle East. They had to have been transported along the same vast trade routes that brought Arabic silver, traveling through the river systems of Russia and the Baltic Sea to finally end up flavoring a stew in a Norse longhouse. This proves that Viking cuisine wasn't just about sustenance. For those who could afford it, it was also about status and enjoying the finer, more cosmopolitan things in life. And no Viking meal, whether a humble family supper or a grand feast in the chieftain's hall, was truly complete without drink. They were prolific brewers of ale made from barley and sweetened with honey or bog myrtle for flavor. This wasn't the high-alcohol beverage we think of today. It was a nutritious, slightly fermented drink that was safer to consume than often contaminated water, and was a daily staple for everyone, including children. For special occasions, they brewed mead, the legendary drink of the gods made from fermented honey. This was a costly and potent symbol of wealth and celebration, central to their most important rituals and social bonds. The act of sharing a drinking horn, passed from person to person in the Great Hall, was a sacred act of community, sealing agreements and strengthening the ties of loyalty between a lord and his followers. So the next time you picture a Viking meal, replace the image of a simple roast with that of a complex, flavorful plate. A hearty stew seasoned with precious imported spices, accompanied by dense rye bread, creamy skaya, and a cup of fine ale, all enjoyed in a smoky hall alive with storytelling and the clinking of horns. It was a diet designed for survival, but also for celebration, proving that Viking culture nourished both the body and the spirit. While we often picture Vikings as sea rovers and rural farmers, their most enduring legacy might actually be found not on the open ocean, but in the bustling, muddy streets of the first true towns ever seen in Scandinavia. These were not just simple villages that grew over time. They were deliberately planned international trading hubs, engineered from the ground up to manage the incredible flow of people and goods from across the known world. Places like Hedeby, Birka, and Koppang were the Manhattan Islands of their day, cosmopolitan, wealthy, and buzzing with activity, representing a revolutionary shift from a scattered, rural society to a concentrated urban one. Take Hedeby, for instance, located in modern-day Germany but then part of the Danevirke border wall system. Hedeby was a marvel of economic and strategic positioning. It sat at the base of the Jutland Peninsula, perfectly placed to avoid the long and dangerous sea journey around its northern tip. Merchants would drag their ships or goods over a short land bridge, saving weeks of time and avoiding treacherous seas. Because of this, Hedeby became the ultimate crossroads. The town was laid out in a neat grid pattern of wooden planking surrounding a natural harbor, with jetties allowing ships to dock and unload directly onto the streets. Walking through Hedeby, you would have heard a cacophony of languages: Old Norse from the locals, Old English from traders across the sea, Low German from the continent, and even snippets of Slavic and Arabic from merchants who had traveled the river routes from the east. The air would have been thick with the smells of tarred ship hulls, smoked fish, and the smoke from countless workshops where craftsmen turned raw materials from abroad into finished goods. Just across the Baltic Sea, the town of Birka on the island of Björka in Sweden served a similar purpose for the eastern trade routes. Protected by a defensive ring fort and a garrison of soldiers, Birka was a secure place to do business. Archaeologists have uncovered over 3,000 graves surrounding the town, and their contents map out a global economy. Traders arriving from the east would bring Islamic silver dirhams, silks from Byzantium, and glass beakers from the Rhineland. In exchange, they loaded their ships with the Nordic riches we discussed earlier: furs from the north, worked iron, and those immensely valuable walrus ivory tusks. The town was filled with specialized artisans, glass bead makers, bronze casters, and comb makers who used antlers from northern elk to create high-quality items that were exported across Europe. Birka wasn't just a market, it was a production center, adding value to raw materials before they entered the vast trade network. Meanwhile, in Norway, the town of Koppang offers some of the clearest evidence of this urban planning. Excavations show it was founded around the year 800 with a specific, organized layout. Plots of land were designated for different purposes. One area for blacksmiths with their forges built away from the wooden houses to prevent fire, another area for fine metal workers, and specific zones for merchants to set up their stalls. This shows a remarkable level of central planning and foresight. The community understood that to attract international trade, they needed to provide facilities, organization, and security. These towns were protected by law, with their own legal codes and governing assemblies that operated separately from the rural countryside, further cementing their status as unique, advanced centers of commerce and culture. The existence of these towns fundamentally changed Scandinavian society. They created a new class of wealthy, urban merchants and craftsmen whose power and influence rivaled that of the old landowning aristocracy. They became melting pots of ideas, technology, and culture, where Norse mythology met Christianity and Islam, and where new styles of art and fashion were born from this cross-cultural exchange. They were the engines that powered the Viking Age, providing the economic infrastructure that funded the raids, the exploration, and the settlement of new lands. Without these first brave steps towards urbanization, the Vikings would have remained a collection of isolated coastal tribes. Instead, they built the networked, dynamic urban centers that laid the groundwork for the modern capitals of Northern Europe, proving their genius was not limited to the deck of a longship. While their sunstones and sun compasses provided a technological edge under challenging skies, the Vikings also possessed a living, breathing navigation system woven directly into the fabric of the natural world around them. Their true secret was an encyclopedic knowledge of the sea itself, an intimate understanding of its rhythms and inhabitants that turned birds, whales, and even the color of the water into reliable guides across the trackless ocean. This wasn't just a backup plan, it was a fundamental part of their seafaring wisdom, a dialogue with nature that complemented their tools and filled in the blanks when the skies were dark for days on end. One of their most trusted methods involved observing the behavior of seabirds, a lone land bird spotted far out at sea, like a tern or a puffin, was a potential signpost. If the bird was flying a steady, purposeful course in the evening, it was almost certainly heading toward land to roost, giving a ship a direction to follow. The type of bird itself was a critical clue. Spotting a raven, a bird that rarely ventures more than a day's flight from shore, was an incredibly encouraging sign that solid ground was near. The sagas even tell of Viking captains carrying ravens in cages on their ships. When they thought they might be nearing land, they would release one of these birds. If the raven flew high and did not return, it had spotted land and the ship would follow its general direction. If the bird circled and returned to the ship, it meant there was no land in sight and the voyage would continue. This use of avian scouts shows a profound understanding of animal behavior, transforming a simple bird into a biological navigation instrument. The ocean's mammals also served as unwitting navigational aids. Vikings learned to recognize the specific feeding grounds and migration routes of different whale species. A pod of pilot whales, for instance, might indicate a certain current or the proximity to particular underwater shelves where their prey gathered. Spotting a familiar type of whale in a certain area could confirm a ship's position or suggest a course correction. The water itself told its own story to a trained eye. They became expert readers of wave patterns. A change in the swell could indicate a shift in depth or the approach of a distant coastline long before it was visible. They learned to interpret the subtle differences in the color of the sea, the darker blue of deep, open water versus the lighter, greener hues of shallower coastal areas. Even the smell carried on the wind became a tool. A seasoned navigator might catch the faint scent of pine forests or the distinct aroma of tundra and peat bogs carried dozens of miles out to sea, providing an invisible beacon pointing the way home or toward a new landfall. This holistic sensory awareness, this ability to read 100 different tiny signs in the environment, was what truly allowed them to conquer the Atlantic, making their navigation a blend of cutting-edge science and ancient, accumulated wisdom. Far from the chaotic anarchy of popular myth, Viking society was bound together by a remarkably sophisticated and intricate legal system that placed a premium on order, compensation, and communal justice. This framework was essential for managing the tensions inherent in a culture that valued personal honor above all else, providing a structured alternative to the devastating spiral of endless bloodshed. At the heart of this system was the concept of the Thing, a local and regional assembly where free men gathered to debate, legislate, and settle disputes. These were not informal meetings, they were the very bedrock of governance, held at fixed times in designated places, often a natural amphitheater or a field marked by a ring of stones. The most famous of these was the Althing in Iceland, a national parliament, but every district had its own local thing where the community's business was conducted openly and publicly. Presiding over these assemblies was one of the most respected figures in Norse society, the lawspeaker or lögsagumaður. In an era before written legal codes were common, this individual was the living library of the law. Elected for a term of 3 years, his duty was to memorize the entire body of law for his region and recite 1/3 of it aloud each year from the law rock, ensuring every citizen knew their rights and obligations. His recitation was the law itself, a mesmerizing performance of oral tradition that required flawless memory and a commanding presence. He didn't just recite rules, he provided the interpretations and precedents that guided every judgment, acting as both a walking legal code and a Supreme Court justice rolled into one. When a dispute arose, whether over stolen property, a contested land border, or a physical assault, the Thing was the arena for resolution. The process was highly formalized. The plaintiff would publicly declare his grievance and call upon witnesses to support his case. The defendant would then offer his rebuttal. There were no lawyers. A man pleaded his own case, and his power often rested on his skill as an orator and, crucially, the support of influential allies. The assembled free men would then hear the evidence and render a verdict, but Viking justice was less about punishment and more about restoration and the prevention of further conflict. The cornerstone of this philosophy was wergild, a man price literally meaning man payment. This was a meticulously detailed schedule of monetary compensation for every conceivable injury or death, its value calibrated to the social status of the victim. The loss of a thumb had a set price, a front tooth another, and the killing of a free landowner required a vastly higher payment than the killing of a thrall. Wergild was not seen as a buy-off. It was a legally mandated, honorable settlement that restored balance to the community and prevented a minor dispute from exploding into a generations-long blood feud. This is not to say blood feuds didn't happen. They were a central theme of the sagas, but even these were governed by a complex web of rules that sought to contain the violence. A killing had to be announced and not done in secret. Revenge was expected, but it had to be proportional. Killing two members of a family in retaliation for one was a breach of this code and could itself justify a new cycle of vengeance. The ultimate legal sanction, and the most feared, was outlawry. To be declared an outlaw was to be placed outside the protection of the law entirely. Your property was forfeit, you were stripped of all legal rights, and anyone could hunt you down and kill you without facing any penalty themselves. It was a civil death sentence that forced the condemned to flee into the wilderness or escape the country altogether. This sophisticated legal architecture, built on oral tradition, public consensus, and calculated compensation, reveals a people deeply invested in creating a stable, functional society, proving that their greatest legacy wasn't just how they wielded their axes, but how they wielded the law. Yet for all their legal codes and navigation skills, the Vikings expressed their deepest beliefs and identities not just through words and deeds, but through a breathtaking visual language that transformed the ordinary into the extraordinary. If you were to ask what Viking art looked like, you might picture simple, bold carvings of dragons and knots. But that simplistic view misses the profound complexity and evolution of a tradition that was every bit as sophisticated as their shipbuilding. Viking art wasn't merely decoration. It was a symbolic code, a way of weaving protective magic, displaying power, and connecting to the cosmos. And it evolved through 6 distinct stylistic periods that tell the story of a culture itself in flux. The journey begins with the Oseberg style, named after the magnificent burial ship excavated in Norway. This art from the early 9th century is a wild, energetic explosion of gripping beasts and serpentine creatures. The defining feature is what scholars call the gripping beast, an animal, often with a rounded body, large eyes, and exaggerated paws that clutch frantically at its own body, the framework around it, or any other creature nearby. This isn't a realistic portrayal of an animal. It's a captured moment of frenzied, almost chaotic energy. You can see it covering every surface of the Oseberg ship itself, from the towering, spiraling serpent head on the prow to the detailed carvings on the sleds and carts buried with the 2 women. The effect is overwhelming, a visual representation of the untamed, raw power of nature and magic that the Vikings believed surrounded them and propelled their ships. As the Viking Age progressed, this chaotic energy began to be tamed and structured, leading to the Bora style, which emerged around the mid-9th century. Named after a site in Norway where distinctive harness mounts were found, this style is instantly recognizable for its symmetrical, heart-shaped animal heads and its sophisticated use of ribbon plate, a continuous, looping braid pattern. The gripping beasts are still there, but they are more controlled, often arranged in perfect symmetry. This style was perfectly suited for personal adornment, appearing on thousands of bronze brooches found across the Viking world. The shift from the wild Oseberg to the orderly Bora might reflect a changing society, one that was becoming more structured, with stronger royal authority and more established trade routes, yet still wanted to display its power through complex, beautiful art. The next leap forward came with the gelling style, a monumental shift that coincided with the political and religious transformation of Scandinavia. This art is named after the small Danish town where King Harald Bluetooth erected a massive runestone to commemorate his parents and, more importantly, his own achievement of uniting Denmark and Norway and converting the Danes to Christianity. The stone's decoration is a masterpiece of this new style. The classic gripping beast has evolved into a single, large, S-shaped animal with a ribbon-like body, often interlacing with itself. It's more elegant and fluid than what came before, but its most revolutionary aspect is its incorporation of new Christian symbolism. Harald's gelling stone features the oldest known depiction of Christ in Scandinavia, right alongside the traditional pagan beast. This style represents a culture in transition, blending old and new visual languages to legitimize a king's power and a people's changing faith. Following this, the Mammon style, emerging in the late 10th century, took that elegance and made it even more lavish. It's named after a grave in Mammon, Denmark, which contained an incredibly ornate iron axe inlaid with silver wire. The axe head is decorated with a large, feathered creature that scholars debate could be either the pagan rooster Gullinkambi, who wakes the warriors in Valhalla, or the Christian phoenix, a symbol of resurrection. This ambiguity is the entire point. The art is dense, fleshy, and organic, with the animal's body often filled with detailed tufts and tendrils that make it seem both powerful and alive. This was the art of the highest elite, a display of immense wealth and technical skill that could carry multiple layers of meaning depending on who was looking at it. This trend toward grandeur reached its peak with the Ringerike style, which flourished in the early 11th century. Named after a region in Norway where a distinctive type of reddish sandstone was carved with these motifs, this art is bold, confident, and impossible to ignore. The creatures are large, with long, graceful tendrils extending from their noses and hips, forming elegant loops and arcs that fill the space. The most famous example is the Vang stone in Norway, a massive slab covered in a huge, sweeping lion-like beast, its body curving to create a powerful, balanced composition. This style was used extensively on rune stones and church portals, a public art designed to project royal and Christian authority on a massive scale. It's a style that shouts rather than whispers, reflecting the confidence of Viking kings who now ruled over powerful, Christianized kingdoms. The final chapter of Viking art is the urn style, and it is perhaps the most breathtakingly elegant of them all. Named after the carved panels on the Urn Stave Church in Norway, this late 11th century art is a world away from the frantic energy of the Oseberg style. It is characterized by a single, dominant quadruped animal, usually a sleek, slender wolf or lion, in graceful combat with a thin, ribbon-like serpent. Their long, looping bodies are intertwined in a complex, harmonious pattern that is both dynamic and perfectly balanced. The lines are thin and precise, creating a sense of refined luxury. The urn style represents the full assimilation of Viking aesthetics into European Christian art. It's the style of the final days of the Viking Age, a beautiful, melancholic swan song that adorns the very churches that signaled the end of the old pagan world, proving that while the gods may have changed, the Viking eye for powerful, symbolic beauty was eternal. This evolution from chaotic beasts to elegant, intertwined creatures shows an artistic journey that mirrors their own. From fierce, independent raiders to integrated Christian European kings, all without ever losing their distinct and powerful visual voice. This darker aspect of their spiritual world forces us to confront a practice that stands in stark contrast to their sophisticated legal systems and urban planning, the ritual of human sacrifice. While the Vikings valued law and order within their own communities, their relationship with the divine sometimes demanded the ultimate offering to secure the favor of the gods, ensure victory in battle, or appease the powers that controlled the harvest. This isn't a subject of gruesome speculation. It's a grim reality supported by both the written accounts of horrified contemporaries and the silent, compelling evidence unearthed by archaeologists. One of the most detailed and chilling descriptions comes from the German chronicler Adam of Bremen, writing around the year 1070. He never visited Scandinavia himself, but gathered accounts from Christians who had, including King Svein Estridsson of Denmark. Adam described the great temple at Uppsala in Sweden as the most significant pagan center in the region, a place where a magnificent golden chain hung from the gables of the hall and the sacred evergreen trees stood beside a well where live human victims were drowned. He claimed that every 9 years a great festival was held that was attended by every province of Sweden. The rituals were presided over by a powerful pagan high priest, and the climax was a sacrificial rite that involved hanging the bodies of 9 males of every living creature, including men, from a tree in the sacred grove. The dogs and horses hanging alongside the humans, Adam noted, created a grisly spectacle that he described as not a little disgusting for the Christians who witnessed it. While historians debate the absolute accuracy of Adam's account, as he had a clear Christian bias and motive to portray pagan practices as barbaric, the core of his story finds echoes in the physical record. Archaeology provides a more concrete and in some ways more terrifying testament to these practices, free from the lens of an outside observer. The most famous sites for this evidence are the peat bogs of Denmark and Northern Europe. These watery, oxygen-poor environments are incredible preservers, and they have yielded bodies that tell a story of ritual killing. Take the case of the Toland man, discovered in Denmark in 1950. He lived during the early Iron Age, slightly before the Viking era, but his manner of death is a clear precursor to the practices that continued. He was found perfectly preserved, lying on his side as if asleep. Around his neck was a braided leather rope tied into a noose. He had been hanged, yet his face shows a serene expression and his hair was neatly trimmed. Most strikingly, his last meal was a simple porridge, a ritual meal perhaps consumed before his sacrifice. He was not a murdered criminal, he was a carefully prepared offering. From the Viking Age itself, we have the woman from Huldremos, also in Denmark. She was pinned down in the bog by branches, and while the cause of her death isn't entirely clear, the context suggests a ritual offering. Perhaps the most dramatic Viking-era example is the site of Lindomoss in England, where Lindoman was found. Though in England, his death reflects Celtic and potentially Norse-influenced practices. He was a high-status individual with well-manicured hands and a trimmed beard. His death was a complex triple killing. He was struck on the head, garroted to the point of suffocation, and his throat was cut, all before being placed face down in the bog. This overkill is a strong indicator of a ritual sacrifice, ensuring the offering was accepted through multiple methods. These bog bodies weren't casually discarded. They were deliberately placed in the water, which was seen as a gateway to the gods, a sacred element that could carry the offering to the divine realm. Beyond the bogs, evidence comes from high-status burials. The magnificent Oseberg ship burial in Norway, final resting place of 2 women of tremendous importance, also contained the skeletons of more than a dozen horses, a cat, and a cattle, and what are believed to be the remains of a human slave, sacrificed to accompany her mistress into the afterlife. While the evidence is sometimes difficult to interpret, the presence of these individuals who did not die of natural causes points to a funerary practice where the power and status of the deceased required a retinue in the next world, obtained through ritual killing. The motivations for these sacrifices were deeply woven into the Norse worldview. An offering had to be valuable to be effective. What could be more valuable than a human life? Sacrifices or blot were performed to ensure a good harvest, to bring victory in an upcoming battle, or to thank the gods for a success. It was a transaction with the divine, a desperate attempt to influence the chaotic forces of nature and fate by giving up something of immense worth. The practice reveals a profound and haunting aspect of the Viking mind, a belief that the cosmos operated on a principle of balance and that the greatest blessings, fertility, victory, prosperity, could only be purchased with the ultimate currency. It's a sobering reminder that this fascinating culture of explorers, traders, and poets also had a capacity for ritualized violence that they believed was necessary to sustain their world. While the image of the independent Viking raider is a powerful one, many of these famed warriors actually found their most lucrative employment far from home, not as conquerors but as highly paid professional soldiers in the service of foreign kings and emperors. This shift from freelance plunderer to elite mercenary was a natural progression for a culture that valued martial skill above almost all else, and it opened up channels of wealth and cultural exchange that would profoundly shape the Viking world. The most legendary of these opportunities lay in the glittering, unimaginably wealthy city of Constantinople, the capital of the Byzantine Empire. Here, the Norse warriors were known by a new name, the Varangians. The Varangian Guard was established in the late 10th century by the Byzantine Emperor Basil II, and it quickly became the most elite and loyal unit in his entire army. He famously turned to Viking mercenaries after they had impressed him with their ferocity in previous conflicts, and he valued one trait above all others: their complete lack of local political ties. Unlike Byzantine soldiers who might have divided loyalties to powerful local families, the Varangians' allegiance was for sale solely to the emperor who paid them. Their primary duty was to act as the emperor's personal bodyguards, a constant, intimidating presence at his side in the magnificent Great Palace, but they were far more than just ceremonial sentries. They were his shock troops deployed at the most critical points on the battlefield, and they served as his trusted enforcers within the empire, a Praetorian guard whose axes ensured his will was done. Life in the Guard was the ultimate adventure for a young Norseman seeking fortune and glory. The journey itself, known as the Ostavega or Eastern Way, was an epic trek down the river systems of Russia, facing dangers from Slavic tribes and treacherous rapids. But the reward at the end was beyond anything they could find in the West. They were paid an enormous salary in pure silver, and their position granted them the right to personally help themselves to the treasure in the emperor's vaults after a successful military campaign, a privilege that made them fabulously wealthy. Their presence in Constantinople was so significant that they even left their mark on the city's greatest church, the Hagia Sophia. If you visit today and look closely at the marble balustrades in the upper gallery, you can still see runic graffiti carved over 1,000 years ago by homesick Varangians. One inscription simply reads, "Halfdan carved these runes," a tiny, personal echo of a Norseman standing in awe beneath the massive dome of what was then the most magnificent building in the Christian world. But the Byzantine Empire was not the only destination for these professional fighters. In the British Isles, the complex political landscape of competing Anglo-Saxon and Celtic kingdoms was a perfect market for their services. Viking bands, often already settled in parts of England and Ireland, would frequently hire themselves out as the decisive force in local wars. An Irish king might pay a Viking fleet in silver, cattle, and land to help him defeat a rival, only to find himself facing those same mercenaries a few years later when they switched sides for a better offer. This practice is recorded in the Irish annals, which meticulously note the comings and goings of these foreigners who could make or break a kingdom. In England, the situation was similar. Before the famous conquests, many Vikings served in the armies of Alfred the Great's successors, sometimes as allies, sometimes as paid muscle in the endless squabbles of the English nobility. The impact of this mercenary life reverberated all the way back to Scandinavia. When these warriors returned home, they didn't just bring chests of Byzantine silver and Arabic coins. They brought new ideas, new technologies, and new cultural influences. They had seen the grandeur of a Christian empire, the discipline of a professional army, and the sophistication of a culture far older than their own. This constant flow of men and ideas back up the river routes into Russia and across the North Sea helped to accelerate the transformation of Viking society, gradually weaving it into the broader fabric of European Christendom. The Varangian, returning home with a fortune and tales of an impossible city of marble and gold, became a powerful agent of change, proving that the Viking axe could build connections as readily as it could destroy them. But the Viking approach to health and healing extended far beyond the physical realm, deeply entwined with the spiritual and the supernatural. If a person fell ill, it wasn't just seen as a biological malfunction. It was often interpreted as a disruption in their luck, a curse from an enemy, or the disfavor of the gods. Consequently, their medical practices were a fascinating and sometimes terrifying blend of practical herbal knowledge, profound superstition, and powerful magic. The Viking healer, or Leiknir, was not just a doctor but a sorcerer, a psychologist, and a priest all rolled into one, wielding a diverse toolkit to combat ailments of both the body and the soul. Their practical knowledge of the natural world was impressive and born of necessity. They had an extensive understanding of herbal remedies, using plants they could find in their local environment to treat a wide range of conditions. Yarrow was a common staple, known for its ability to staunch bleeding from wounds, a crucial skill for a culture of warriors. They would chew the leaves directly and pack them into a cut as a field dressing. Angelica was revered as a powerful cure-all, used to treat everything from plague and fever to digestive problems. Even the humble dandelion was utilized for its diuretic properties. These remedies weren't just random guesses. Many have been confirmed by modern science to contain active compounds with real medicinal value. The pain-relieving properties of willow bark, which contains a natural form of salicylic acid, the key component of aspirin, were almost certainly known and exploited by Viking healers. Yet for every effective treatment, there were practices that seem utterly bizarre to the modern mind, rooted in a worldview where symbolism and ritual were as potent as any chemical. One of the strangest recorded treatments was known as field running, a cure for a disease called alpha blot thought to be caused by malevolent elves. The treatment involved building two large bonfires and then driving all the livestock from the farm between the two blazes. The sick person would then be forced to run between the fires as well. The belief was that the purifying power of the fire would scorch away the illness and the evil influence causing it. While the psychological effect of such a dramatic ritual might have provided a boost to the patient, its true power lay in the symbolic cleansing of the entire farmstead, livestock and all, restoring harmony to the community. Surgery was also attempted with a degree of skill that is both shocking and admirable. Archaeologists have found skulls from the Viking Age that show clear evidence of trepanation, the practice of drilling or scraping a hole into the human skull. This was likely an attempt to relieve pressure from a severe head injury or to treat what they perceived as madness or demonic possession. Incredibly, some of these skulls show signs of healing, meaning the individual survived this brutal procedure, at least for a while. They also practiced a rudimentary form of surgery for boils and abscesses, using specially designed tools to lance and drain them. The most vital aspect of their medicine, however, was the inseparable link to magic and incantation. A healer wouldn't just apply a poultice, they would chant a specific spell over it to activate its power. These charms, or galder, were often recorded in runes on sticks or recited from memory. One surviving charm, intended to stanch bleeding, invokes the gods Odin and Thor, commanding the blood to stop flowing as firmly as the gods fastened their ships and secured their halls. Another, for a difficult birth, calls upon the gods to loosen the child, as Loki's fetters were loosened. The power was believed to reside in the specific words themselves, and a correctly recited charm was considered essential for the remedy to work. This holistic approach, which saw no contradiction between a physical herb and a magical verse, reveals a culture that viewed health as a delicate balance between the visible and invisible worlds, where a successful cure required addressing the cause on every possible level. But behind every raid, every daring voyage across the North Atlantic, and every ambitious settlement, there was an invisible, all-powerful force at work, one that provided the essential conditions for their entire age of expansion. We often focus on their courage and their ships, but without a dramatic shift in the very climate of the planet, the Viking Age might have looked entirely different, or perhaps not happened at all. Their story is not just one of human ambition, it is a powerful lesson in how environmental change can rewrite human history. The key to understanding this lies in a period known as the medieval warm period, a climatic anomaly that transformed the frozen north into a highway for exploration. This era, which spanned roughly from the year 950 to 1250 AD, saw average temperatures across the North Atlantic region rise by a few degrees Celsius. While that might not sound like much, its effects were absolutely transformative. In Scandinavia, where the growing season was already short and precarious, this warming was a game changer. Longer, warmer summers and milder winters meant that crops like barley and rye, the staples of the Viking diet, could be cultivated more reliably and yield larger harvests. This agricultural boom had a direct and powerful impact on society. More food means a larger population. Farms that once could only support a single family now had surplus to feed more people. This population growth created pressure but also opportunity. With more mouths to feed and with inheritance laws that often left younger sons with little land of their own, there was a powerful incentive to look outward, to seek new lands and new sources of wealth beyond the fjords. The warming climate didn't just fill their bellies, it filled their ships with restless, ambitious young men ready to make their mark on the world. Perhaps the most dramatic effect of this warming was on the sea itself. The Arctic ice, which for centuries had formed a formidable, impenetrable barrier to the north, began to retreat. The sea routes around Greenland and, crucially, the path across the North Atlantic to Iceland and beyond became far more navigable. The reduction in pack ice and icebergs made these journeys less suicidal, opening a window of opportunity that the Vikings were uniquely equipped to exploit. This wasn't just a matter of convenience, it was the difference between possibility and impossibility. The legendary voyages of explorers like Eric the Red and Leif Erikson, who settled Greenland and reached North America, were directly facilitated by these newly accessible, ice-free corridors of water. They were sailing on a warmer ocean, following routes that had been closed for centuries. This climatic advantage even extended to their new homes. When Eric the Red famously named that vast icy island, Greenland, he wasn't just engaging in deceptive marketing, he was likely describing what he actually saw. Archaeological evidence from the Norse settlements in Greenland shows that during the height of the medieval warm period, the conditions there were indeed significantly milder than they are today. They were able to establish dairy farms, grow some barley, and raise cattle, a standard of living that would become utterly impossible when the climate shifted again centuries later. The warm period gave them a foothold, a generations-long opportunity to build a life in a world that was temporarily more welcoming. So while we rightly celebrate the Vikings for their incredible seamanship and bold spirit, we must also acknowledge the role played by a warming planet. It was the gentle push of a changing climate that helped launch their ships, making the Viking Age a stunning example of humanity riding the waves of global environmental change. And while the Varangian God was forging a legendary reputation in the Byzantine Empire, back in the vast riverlands of Eastern Europe, other groups of Vikings were engaged in a project of even greater historical consequence, the creation of the very first Russian state. This astonishing chapter begins not with a conquest but with a desperate invitation. According to the ancient Russian primary chronicle, the various Slavic and Finnic tribes living around Novgorod were locked in bitter internecine warfare. Exhausted by the conflict and unable to establish a stable rule of law among themselves, they made a fateful decision. They said to themselves, "Let us seek a prince who may rule over us and judge us according to the law." Their search for leadership took them overseas to the land of the Varangian Rus, a group of Swedish Vikings who had already established trading posts along the Baltic coast. They went to the Rus and said, "Our land is great and rich, but there is no order in it. Come reign as princes over us." The man who answered this call around the year 862 was a Viking chieftain named Rurik. He arrived with his two brothers, Sineas and Truva, and his band of warriors, and he established his rule at Holmgard, which we know today as Novgorod. This event, the calling of the Varangians, is the founding myth of the Russian state, and while historians debate the exact details, archaeology confirms a powerful Norse presence at this exact time. Rurik's arrival marked the beginning of the Rurikid dynasty, a line of rulers that would dominate the region for over 7 centuries, but this was not a simple case of foreign domination. The Vikings, or Rus as they were called here, did not come to wipe out the local population. They came to organize it to control the immensely profitable trade routes that ran like arteries through the land, and in doing so, they began a process of cultural fusion that would give birth to a new civilization. The true prize that drew these Swedish Vikings deep into the interior was the magnificent river network itself. They sailed their incredible shallow draft longships from the Baltic Sea up the western Dvina and the Lovat rivers. At key points, they would drag their ships overland, a process called portage, to reach the headwaters of the Dnieper and Volga rivers. These were the superhighways of the medieval world, leading south to the Black Sea and the Caspian Sea, and ultimately to the fabulously wealthy empires of Byzantium and the Abbasid Caliphate. The Vikings were the masters of this logistics chain, and their goal was to bring northern goods, furs, honey, wax, and slaves, to the southern markets and return with the most coveted substance of the age, silver. The Arab diplomat Ibn Fadlan, who encountered these Rus traders on the Volga River in the 10th century, left a stunningly detailed account of their appearance and customs. He described them as perfect physical specimens, tall as date palms with flaming red hair and skin, tattooed from fingernails to neck with dark green designs. He was both fascinated and horrified by their rituals, particularly their elaborate ship burials for chieftains, which included human sacrifice. His account provides an unforgettable eyewitness portrait of these Viking pioneers in the East. To protect these vital trade routes and to consolidate their power, the Rus established a series of fortified trading posts. The most important of these became Kiev. According to the Chronicle, 2 of Rurik's men, Askold and Dyer, first took control of this strategic high bluff on the Dnieper River, but it was Rurik's successor, Oleg of Novgorod, who truly forged a state. In 882, he seized Kiev, famously declaring it shall be the mother of all Russian cities. He united the northern and southern centers of Rus power under a single rule, creating the state of Kievan Rus. This was not a Viking kingdom in the sense of a colonial outpost. It was a Slavic Viking hybrid. The ruling elite was initially Norse, but they quickly assimilated into the much larger local Slavic population. They adopted Slavic language, customs, and within a few generations, even their names became Slavicized. The Rurikid princes became Slavic kings, ruling over a vast and powerful state that was the direct ancestor of modern Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus. The legacy of this Viking founding is etched permanently into the region's identity. The very name Russia derives from Rus, the term for these Swedish Vikings. This cultural fusion is also profoundly evident in the legal and administrative structures they established. The first written legal code for the Eastern Slavs, the Russkaya Pravda, or Russian Truth, was introduced by Yaroslav the Wise, a descendant of Rurik in the 11th century. It bears striking similarities to earlier Scandinavian law codes, focusing on concepts like weregild, the monetary compensation for injuries, which was a cornerstone of Viking justice. The dynasty Rurik ruled Russia until the time of Ivan the Terrible in the 16th century, and their impact shaped the political and cultural landscape of Eastern Europe for 1,000 years, proving that the Vikings' greatest talent was not just destruction, but the breathtaking ability to build empires from the ground up. But to truly appreciate these vessels, we have to look past the dragon-headed prows and understand the revolutionary engineering hidden beneath the waterline. The Vikings didn't just build boats, they perfected a form of maritime architecture so advanced it would not be surpassed for centuries. The absolute bedrock of their shipbuilding genius was the clinker-built or lapstrake construction method. Unlike the carvel-built ships of the Mediterranean, where planks are laid edge to edge on a rigid internal frame, Viking shipwrights started with the shell. They began by laying a sturdy keel, the backbone of the ship. Then they carefully overlapped long, flexible oak planks known as strakes and riveted them together with thousands of sturdy iron nails. This created a hull that was not just strong, but incredibly flexible, a critical feature for surviving the violent, ice-choked waters of the North Atlantic. Imagine a modern car with a rigid chassis hitting a pothole, the entire frame shudders. Now imagine a car designed to flex and absorb the impact. That was the Viking longship. In a rough sea, a rigid hull would be pounded to splinters by the relentless waves. A clinker-built hull, however, could twist and move with the sea, riding the swells like a living creature. This resilience was their secret weapon for open ocean travel. This overlapping design also had another crucial benefit. It created a series of steps or ridges running horizontally along the hull. These ridges significantly increased the surface area contacting the water, which drastically improved stability and tracking, helping to prevent the ship from sliding sideways in a strong crosswind. It was a beautifully simple yet profoundly effective piece of hydrodynamic engineering. The genius continued with the internal framework. Instead of building a rigid skeleton first, the Vikings shaped the pliable shell of overlapping planks and then inserted the ribs or frames afterward. These frames were notched to fit snugly over the inward-facing ridges of the overlapping planks, and they were then lashed into place with supple spruce root or animal sinew. This lashing allowed for even more give and flex, creating a ship that was both incredibly tough and surprisingly lightweight. The entire structure was a masterclass in balanced tension and flexibility, a wooden symphony of engineering that could withstand forces that would shatter a more rigid design. Beyond the hull, every other feature was meticulously optimized for performance and versatility. The ships were perfectly symmetrical, both from bow to stern and from top to bottom. This symmetrical design meant there was no dedicated front or back. If a crew needed to reverse direction quickly, perhaps to escape a pursuing force or navigate out of a narrow fjord, they could simply have the rowers change benches and push the ship backward with the same efficiency as going forward. The steering was handled by a single, large steering oar mounted on the right-hand side of the vessel, which is why we still call it the starboard side from the Old Norse styri steer and borth side. The port side was the side they docked against the harbor to avoid damaging the steering oar, and it's a mistake to think there was just one type of Viking ship. They were master naval architects who designed specific vessels for highly specialized roles. The most famous is the langskip or longship, the fearsome warship designed for raiding and battle. These were long, narrow, and built for speed and a shallow draft, allowing them to sail up shallow rivers and land directly on beaches. They were packed with oar ports and relied on a large, square sail for open water. Then there was the Gnar, the workhorse of the Viking world. This was the ocean-going cargo ship, broader, deeper, and sturdier than the longship, with a vast cargo hold amidships and a smaller crew. It was the Gnar that carried settlers, livestock, and trade goods across the Atlantic to Iceland, Greenland, and beyond. They even had smaller, specialist vessels like the Kavi, a general-purpose ship used for local trade and fishing. This level of specialization shows a society that didn't just use the sea, they had mastered it intellectually, designing a precise tool for every single maritime challenge they faced. Their ships were not just transport, they were the physical manifestation of Viking ambition, ingenuity, and their profound connection to the ocean. Yet for all their shared identity as Vikings, their society was far from an egalitarian band of brothers. It was a meticulously structured hierarchy, a world of sharply defined roles, responsibilities, and rights that governed every aspect of life from the Great Hall to the humblest farmstead. Understanding this social pyramid is key to moving beyond the one-dimensional image of the Viking and seeing the complex, stratified civilization they truly built. At its core, this structure was divided into three distinct tiers: the mighty Jarls, the industrious Carls, and the oppressed thralls, each bound together by a powerful, unwritten code of honor that dictated everything from legal worth to personal reputation. At the very apex of this world stood the Jarls, the aristocratic nobility. These were the wealthy landowners, the powerful chieftains, and the regional kings. Their power was derived from their vast estates, their ownership of magnificent longships, and their command of large retinues of loyal warriors. A Jarl's life was one of obligation and display. He was expected to be a generous lord, hosting lavish feasts in his great hall where he would freely distribute food, drink, and valuable gifts like arm rings and weapons to his followers. This generosity wasn't just a nice personality trait, it was the very engine of his power. In return for this bounty, his men owed him absolute loyalty, forming the core of his army and the basis of his political influence. The Jarls were the decision-makers, the lawmakers at the Thing, and the leaders of the great raids and trading expeditions. They lived in a world of high politics, intricate alliances, and often violent competition with other Jarls for land, wealth, and prestige. Their status was visibly displayed in the quality of their weapons, their finely crafted jewelry, and the sheer scale of their feasts, all designed to broadcast their power and secure their position at the top of the social order. Beneath them, forming the robust backbone of Viking society, were the Carls. This was the largest class, encompassing everyone who owned their own land or possessed a valuable trade. The Carl was the free farmer, tending his own plot with his family and perhaps a few thralls. He was the skilled blacksmith, the shipbuilder, the artisan, and the independent merchant. What defined a Carl above all else was his legal status as a free man. He had the right to own property, to bear arms, and to have a voice at the local Thing assembly where he could vote on laws and disputes. His honor and his economic self-sufficiency were his most prized possessions. While a Carl might choose to follow a particular Jarl for protection or opportunity, he was not bound to the land like a feudal serf in medieval Europe. He was his own man. The sagas are filled with stories of proud Carls who stood as equals before the law, fiercely defending their rights and their reputations. This class was the engine of the Viking economy and the source of its formidable military strength, as every free man was expected to answer the call to arms when needed. At the very bottom, supporting the entire structure through their forced labor, were the thralls. As we've explored, they were slaves, pure and simple property with no legal rights. They were the absolute underclass, acquired through war, trade, or as punishment for debt, and they performed the hardest, most grueling work, clearing land, mining, tending livestock, and manual labor on farms. A thrall's life was one of total dependency and vulnerability, entirely subject to the whims of their owner. Their value was purely economic, and their existence was a stark contrast to the freedom and honor cherished by the Carls and Jarls. But what truly animated this rigid structure, what gave it a surprising degree of fluidity and prevented it from collapsing under its own weight, was the all-consuming culture of honor. This wasn't a vague concept, it was a practical, daily code that governed every interaction. A person's honor was their social currency, a combination of their reputation for bravery, integrity, generosity, and truthfulness. For a Jarl, honor meant being a strong leader and a generous lord. For a Carl, it meant being a capable provider, a good neighbor, and a man of his word. This culture was enforced through the powerful mechanisms of the law and the potent force of public opinion. To be called dishonorable was a devastating insult that could destroy a person's standing in the community. This is where the potential for social mobility emerged. While it was difficult, it was not impossible for an exceptional individual to climb the social ladder. A particularly brave and successful Carl, through prowess in battle or a shrewd trade venture that amassed great wealth, could gain enough followers and respect to eventually be considered a Jarl. His honor and deeds could effectively rewrite his social destiny. Conversely, a Jarl who proved himself to be a miser, a coward, or an oath-breaker could see his honor evaporate, his followers abandon him, and his family's status crumble over generations. The law itself recognized this, calibrating the value of a person's life through the system of weregild directly to their social standing. The killing of a Jarl demanded a massive payment, while the killing of a thrall was treated as minor property damage. This intricate, honor-bound hierarchy shows a society that valued order and reputation above all else, a world where your birth was your starting point, but your actions ultimately determined your worth. While a fascination with epic ship burials and flaming pyres dominates our modern imagination, the reality of Viking funerary practices was a rich and varied tapestry, reflecting their complex beliefs about the afterlife, social status, and the necessity of equipping the dead for the journey ahead. The most spectacular send-offs were reserved for the elite, and few accounts are as vivid or chilling as that of Ahmad ibn Fadlan, an Arab diplomat from the court of the Caliph of Baghdad. Traveling along the Volga River in the 10th century, he witnessed and meticulously documented the funeral of a high-ranking Rus chieftain, a ceremony of such staggering scale and ritual complexity that it reads like a scene from myth, yet was described by a sober, first-hand observer. Ibn Fadlan's account begins with the chieftain's body laid in a temporary grave for 10 days while his retinue prepared his final garments and his people gathered. The centerpiece of the entire ritual was his ship, pulled ashore and placed upon a great platform of wood. For a culture where the ship was the ultimate symbol of power, mobility, and identity, it was the perfect vessel to carry a leader into the next world. The chieftain was then exhumed, dressed in fine clothes, and propped up on a couch inside a specially erected tent on the deck of the ship, surrounded by an astonishing array of grave goods. There was food and drink for his journey, his personal weapons, and beautifully crafted offerings of fruit and herbs. The sacrifice of animals followed: a dog, 2 horses, 2 cows, a rooster, and a hen, their bodies placed alongside him. This was not mere destruction of property, it was the provisioning of an expedition into the unknown, ensuring the chieftain would arrive in the afterlife with his wealth, his means of transport, and his sustenance intact. Then came the most profound and disturbing element of the ritual, the choice of a human companion. One of the chieftain's slave women, who Ibn Fadlan says had volunteered for the duty, was attended to by 2 other women called the Angel of Death and her daughter. For days leading up to the funeral, she was treated with immense reverence, fed lavish meals, and told she would soon join her master. On the final day, she was lifted 3 times above a doorframe-like structure, each time giving a glimpse into the afterlife. She said she saw her parents the first time, her relatives the second, and finally she saw her master waiting for her in a beautiful green place. After these visions, she was given ritual intoxicating drinks, and the men began to beat their shields with clubs to drown out her cries, which might bring bad luck. She was then led into the tent on the ship, where the 6 men inside had intercourse with her, an act Ibn Fadlan interpreted as a final ritual duty. Afterwards, she was laid beside her dead master, and the 6 men held her down as the Angel of Death placed a cord around her neck. As two men pulled the ends of the cord tight, the angel of death herself plunged a dagger into the girl's chest. This brutal act was the climax of the ceremony, a sacrifice intended to provide the chieftain with a servant, a companion, and a symbol of his power that transcended death itself. With the sacrifices complete, the chieftain's closest relative, now naked, walked backwards towards the ship with a burning torch to set the pyre alight. Then the entire community came forward to add their own torches to the blaze. Ibn Fadlan describes the fire as a fearsome wind, engulfing the ship, the tent, the man, the woman, and everything within it in a roaring inferno. Within an hour, everything was consumed, reduced to ash. The final act was to raise a mound over the ashes and erect a wooden post on top, inscribed with the name of the chieftain and his people, a permanent marker of his passage and his status. While Ibn Fadlan's account is the most detailed, archaeology confirms the core of these practices, though with significant variation. Not all Vikings received such spectacular send-offs, and the choice between burial and cremation was likely influenced by regional traditions, family custom, and the individual's status. The magnificent Oseberg burial in Norway, for instance, involved no great pyre. Instead, a massive, ornate ship was dragged ashore and a burial chamber was built on its deck. Inside, two women of incredibly high status, one perhaps a queen, the other possibly a Volva or Cirrus, were laid to rest on a grand bed. They were surrounded by a mind-boggling collection of goods for the afterlife. A richly decorated cart, 4 elaborately carved sledges, beds, tapestries, buckets of food, cooking equipment, and even the skeletons of 15 horses, 6 dogs, and 2 cows. The ship was then covered with a massive mound of peat and stone, sealing them in their watery vessel for over 1,000 years until its discovery. This inhumation burial, preserving the body and the goods, suggests a different belief about the journey to the afterlife, perhaps one where the physical vessel itself, interred in the earth, was the conduit to the next world. For the vast majority of Vikings, however, funerals were far simpler, though no less important. A free farmer might be buried in a stone-lined grave with his personal tools, a scythe, a knife, a hammer, and perhaps a single weapon alongside provisions for the journey. Others were cremated on simpler pyres, their ashes then collected and buried in an urn, often with a few personal items. The common thread weaving through every type of burial, from the grandest ship funeral to the humblest grave, was the imperative to equip the dead. They needed their weapons to fight in the next world, their tools to farm, their jewelry to display their rank, and their ships to sail to their final destination. A funeral was the last, and perhaps most critical, act of provisioning for a voyage from which no one returns. A final testament to a culture that believed life, in all its forms, was a journey that demanded thorough preparation. And yet, the most extraordinary voyage of the Vikings isn't one that ended in a grave or a saga. It's the journey that never truly ended, the one that continues to shape our world in ways both obvious and hidden. Their legacy isn't just buried in the past, it's woven into the very words we speak, the blood in our veins, and the stories we love to tell. While their age of longships and raids faded into history, their influence embarked on a new kind of conquest, one of language, genetics, and imagination, forever embedding the Norse spirit into the fabric of modern life. Let's start with the words that echo from their halls into our daily conversations. Every time you feel something has been ransacked, you're using a word straight from Old Norse. Rannsaka literally meant to search a house, but for a Viking, that search was rarely polite. When a soldier or an athlete goes berserk, they're channeling the terrifying fury of the legendary Berserker warriors. Even the most mundane aspects of life carry their whispers. Your husband, that word comes from the Old Norse husbandi, meaning the master of the house. The sky above you, from the Norse sky, meaning a cloud, the dirt beneath your feet, from their word drit, the very law that governs society, from their word lag. And think of the things you use: a knife from Niffer, a window from Vindogga or Wind Eye, and even the trusty axle on your car. These aren't just loan words, they are the subtle, lingering footprints of a culture that didn't just visit English shores, it moved in, settled down, and forever changed the language's DNA, leaving us with a vocabulary forged in fire and adventure. But the Viking imprint is far more than just linguistic. For millions of people, it's quite literally written in their genes. Modern DNA science has launched a fascinating new exploration, mapping the genetic legacy of Viking expansion across Europe and beyond. The massive Viking DNA study published in 2020 analyzed skeletons from burial sites across Europe and Greenland, then compared them to the genetic makeup of modern populations. The findings are breathtaking. They confirm that the Vikings were not a single, homogeneous group but distinct populations from what is now Sweden, Denmark, and Norway, each with their own preferred trade and raid routes. And their genetic signature is still there. The study found strong Scandinavian ancestry in the United Kingdom and Ireland, correlating exactly with the areas of known Viking settlement like the Danelaw in England. But the traces go much further. Significant Viking ancestry appears in Poland, stemming from the slave trade and settlement along the Baltic coast. It's even found in people from southern Europe, a result of the Varangian guardsmen and traders who traveled to Constantinople and beyond, sometimes settling there and starting families. For many, a DNA test result showing Scandinavian ancestry isn't just a historical curiosity. It's a personal, biological connection to a longship's captain or a Norse settler from over 1,000 years ago, a living heirloom passed down through countless generations. This tangible, historical reality, however, often battles with the powerful force of modern mythology. Our popular culture is utterly enthralled by a romanticized and often wildly inaccurate version of the Viking. From the operas of Wagner that gave us the horned helmet to the muscular, angst-ridden gods of Marvel comics and movies, the Norse image is a flexible tool for storytelling. The History Channel's series Vikings brought a gritty, visceral energy to the screen, thrilling audiences with its drama, even as it took generous liberties with timelines and facts for narrative effect. Meanwhile, the video game Assassin's Creed Valhalla allows millions to virtually explore a beautifully rendered, if heavily fantasized, version of 9th century England. This isn't a bad thing. This creative reinterpretation keeps the Viking spirit alive and sparks curiosity that often leads people to discover the real history. The key is to understand the difference between the inspiring myth and the astonishing reality. The truth is, you don't need to add horns to their helmets or magic to their swords to make them fascinating. The reality of their exploration, their legal innovation, their artistic genius, and their complex society is more compelling than any fiction. The Vikings continue to captivate us not because they were simple superheroes, but because they were profoundly, complicatedly human, ambitious, brutal, creative, and resilient. Their true legacy is the enduring proof that history's greatest explorers are not those who simply conquer land, but those whose ideas, words, and very being conquer time itself. So as our voyage through these 30 secrets comes to an end, let's drop anchor one last time and look back at the horizon we've crossed. The image that emerges is not the simple one we started with. The Viking, we now know, was not a single thing. They were not just the raider emerging from the mist, but the master shipbuilder whose revolutionary clinker-built design could flex with the fury of the North Atlantic. They were the navigator, not just guided by stars, but by the subtle reading of bird flight, wave patterns, and the mysterious sunstone crystal, a tool of science so advanced it feels like magic. They were the metallurgist, patiently folding and twisting iron in the fire to create pattern-welded swords of legendary strength and beauty, and the artisan crafting intricate jewelry with a precision that rivals any culture of its time. Their society was a complex tapestry, not a brutish hierarchy. We found the powerful woman, a military commander buried with the full honors of a strategist, shattering the myth of a purely domestic female role. We sat in the assembly of the Althing, one of the world's first parliaments, where free men gathered to debate law and settle disputes with a sophisticated legal system based on honor and compensation, not just brute force. We saw their global economic network, a breathtaking operation that moved Arabic silver from Baghdad to York, walrus ivory from Greenland to Rome, and even a bronze Buddha from India to a trader's home in Sweden. They were the original globalizers, connecting continents through trade routes that stretched further than anyone in Europe had ever dreamed possible. And their legacy, it is not confined to history books or museum displays. It is alive in our very speech, in words like sky and law and husband. It is written in the DNA of millions across Europe, a biological echo of their expansive journeys. It is etched into the political foundations of nations, from the parliamentary traditions inspired by their assemblies to the very name of Russia, born from the Viking ruse. They were the founders of the first urban centers in Scandinavia, the innovators of maritime technology, and the pioneers who reached North America 5 centuries before Columbus. The Viking Age was not an era of mindless destruction. It was a period of breathtaking creation, exploration, and connection. They were, in the end, one of the most fascinatingly complex and influential civilizations in human history. Their story is a powerful reminder that history is always deeper, richer, and far more surprising than the legends suggest, urging us to always look beyond the horned helmet to discover the true marvels that lie beneath. But perhaps the most thrilling part of this journey is that it never truly ends. History is a living thing, constantly being rewritten with every new archaeological dig and every fresh analysis of an ancient text. So now I want to hear from you. Which of these Viking secrets completely rewired your brain? Was it the fact that they beat Columbus to North America by 500 years, the incredible truth about their hygiene, or the bone-chilling evidence of a high-ranking female military commander? Let me know your biggest surprise down in the comments. I read every single one and love hearing what sparks your curiosity. If you're hungry for more adventures that shatter the myths of the past, make sure you hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. We've got so many more historical mysteries to uncover together. In fact, why not help decide where we set sail next? Let me know which fascinating civilization you'd like a deep dive on. Should we unravel the mysteries of the Maya and their astonishing calendar, or perhaps venture into the hidden world of the Silk Road? And get ready, because in our next episode, we're traveling to a sun-scorched desert to decode the secrets of an empire so powerful, so advanced, and so mysterious that its true story has been hidden for millennia. You won't want to miss it. Until then, thank you for watching, and